This happened a few winters ago. I had just finalized my divorce about 6 months earlier, and to put it lightly, I needed a reset. Christina, my girlfriend at the time, suggested we take a trip somewhere quiet, something different from the chaos I'd been dealing with. We found a rental on a lake in upstate New York, and I booked it for a week without much thought. The place was exactly what I was looking for. A modern but cozy house positioned right on the lake, surrounded by woods, with only a handful of other properties scattered along the shoreline. Most of them were empty. It wasn't exactly peak season for lakefront living. I welcomed that, though. I really just wanted to be as far from civilization as possible. The host wasn't going to be there, but he gave us some detailed instructions on where to find the keys, some stuff about the house, all the standard Airbnb stuff. We arrived in the morning, and when we got there was a small package sitting on the front steps waiting for us. There was no return address, just a little handwritten note that said, "Enjoy your stay, make sure to stay warm." That part was kind of cute. But there was something else in the package, a tiny box of matches. We figured it was some kind of welcome gift, a weird one, but harmless enough. Christina laughed and made a joke about how the upstate people have always been a little odd, and that was that. The next 2 days were exactly what we wanted. Long hikes through the snow, hot drinks by the fireplace, total peace and quiet. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that the snow had been steadily falling since we arrived. Not quite a blizzard because there wasn't that much wind or fog, but there was enough snow to make the landscape feel untouched. It was perfect. I think it's a good time to describe the layout of the house, at least somewhat. The master bedroom where we slept was on the second floor. It had these massive windows across from the bed that overlooked the lake. The roof, or at least the windows, must have been pretty thin because we could hear the patter of snowflakes from inside, which was a really nice touch. There was also a skylight in there, so we could fall asleep to the beautiful sky and snow. Sometime after midnight on the third night, I woke up to a sound. It was barely audible over the sound of the wind and the snow. The first thing I noticed was actually the storm. The snowfall had gotten considerably heavier since I had fallen asleep, and the outdoors was starting to resemble more of a blizzard. I shifted my focus back to the sound and realized why it stuck out. It sounded man-made, almost mechanical, unlike the natural sounds you'd expect to hear out in the wilderness. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake up Christina, and I made my way across the room. I looked out the window and saw the last thing I expected to see. A snowmobile. It was moving slowly across the ice. I know it's not the most abnormal thing. People drive snowmobiles on frozen lakes all the time, but I was just so confused given how late it was. Like I said, the snow was falling more heavily now, so visibility wasn't great, but I could still make out the shape. The driver was moving cautiously, like they weren't completely sure about the ice, and then they just stopped entirely. I watched as the person climbed off and started waving their hands like they were in distress. It looked like they were shouting, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. To my horror, I realized that they were facing in the direction of our house. Did they know we were there? It was impossible. Either way, it looked like they needed help. So I woke Christina and told her what was happening. Then I got dressed, went downstairs, and stepped outside onto the deck. It was freezing, even with the layers I was wearing. As soon as I opened the door, I got hit with another surprise. The person on the ice was a woman. I could tell because she was shouting for help, saying, "Thank God someone's there," and repeating that she lost her little boy somewhere in the snowstorm. It sounded like she was crying, or borderline hysterical. It wasn't a question of whether or not I'd help. If there was a child out there in that weather all alone, they weren't gonna last long. I laced my boots and made my way toward the lake, telling Christina to stay inside. As I approached the woman, I started to make out more details of her appearance. She was bundled up in a thick fur coat, and her hair was pulled back into a tight braid. The ice was completely solid. There wasn't even a chance of falling through. So I started to relax, knowing that it would have been impossible for that little boy to have fallen through. As I got closer, she started saying that he had run away from home and that she was looking for him. That statement gave me some pause. I had expected her to say something like he had fallen off her snowmobile and she hadn't noticed, and then I started to think about how ridiculous even that story was. How the hell do you not notice your own kid falling off a snowmobile? The adrenaline must have been clouding my judgment, because I hadn't even thought about that until right then. I was just about to ask her for more details when she said something that literally made me freeze. She asked me if I still got those matches, and I could tell she was smiling. For a split second, I had no idea what she was talking about, and then it all clicked at once. The matches, that package from the first day, the note. She had left it, not our host. Before I could react, she reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. She demanded my wallet and phone, and I gave them to her. I had no other choice. The whole interaction happened within the span of not even 30 seconds. Without another word, she climbed back onto the snowmobile and disappeared into the whiteout. As she was speeding away, I turned towards the house and ran as fast as I could on the ice, shouting for Christina to call the police the whole time. She was already on the phone with them when I finally made it back to the house. I locked the doors and paced the room, still shaking. I kept looking outside, half expecting to see that snowmobile circling back. The cops showed up about an hour later. By that point, the fresh snowfall had already covered any tracks that woman had left behind. Christina was hysterical, but I was mostly angry. I had come here for peace. There was hope, though. I couldn't think of a reliable way that woman had gotten her snowmobile onto the lake, so I expected the police to at least find the vehicle abandoned somewhere. Unfortunately, I was wrong. The police searched the area and found an old boat ramp on the far side of the lake. Their best guess was that she had come from there. I was furious and insisted they keep looking, but they told me the same thing I already knew. There wasn't much they could do. Even if she left something behind, they'd never find it in all the snow. With Christina's help, I tried tracking my phone, but by that point, it was already offline. The one good thing about the whole ordeal was that the Airbnb host refunded the entire trip. He sounded genuine on the phone and confirmed that he knew nothing about a welcome package, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. How could that woman have possibly known we'd be staying there? And why go to such elaborate lengths just for a simple robbery? I couldn't help but think the host had something to do with it, but I had no proof. I brought it up with Airbnb, but they were about as helpful as you'd expect. I know I've always been a paranoid guy, but for the longest time after that, I couldn't help but feel that my ex-wife had something to do with it. It honestly makes me angry writing about this. I can just imagine her stupid face laughing at my expense. I've since come to terms with how unlikely that possibility is, but the whole thing still doesn't make any sense. Even now, I have no idea why someone would do all of that just for a wallet and phone, unless they were seriously messed up in the head and got some kind of sick pleasure out of it. My family owns a Northern California lake house that we visit for a couple of short weeks out of the year during primetime summer weather. It's 2 stories tall with an attic. When my younger sister and I were little, we used to climb into the attic and pretend we were camping with sleeping bags. We would even bring our puppy up there. There was one small window in the attic that we would peer through to look down at the lake. We always got a kick from watching people. In our early teenage years, we got a bit too big for both of us to stay in the attic comfortably, so that put an end to our sleeping bag antics. Looking back, it was a little sad, but everyone's got to grow up eventually. When our grandparents died, my parents inherited the remainder of their furniture. We had some space to fit the bigger furniture pieces, but the attic ended up getting stuffed with the smaller hand-me-down items. My parents didn't really have the heart to get rid of any of it, as it was all they had left of my Nana and Pop. It felt bittersweet putting all of my grandparents' stuff up there, but it felt reassuring knowing that little pieces of their most cherished items were still watching over us in a way. That whole period honestly felt like the ending of my childhood, and I bet my sister would agree. As we got older, it got harder for my family to make it out there to the lake house due to my studies and my parents' work. At best, we could all maybe get a singular week off for a family trip, but nothing beyond that. My parents didn't really want to rent it out during the many months we weren't there because they were scared of getting their antiques ripped off or broken by sketchy tenants. So for most of the year, it was more or less abandoned, only really being kept up by the landscapers my parents had to deal with. But a few years back, they met a local elderly veteran now working as an antique craft restorationist. and eventually signed a year-long lease with him, trusting him not to rough up the place. He was a small, disfigured man with white hair and one of those gruff, greasy beards. We all thought he looked a bit bizarre, with a gravelly, off-putting voice to match. But my dad bonded with the guy over his military background. My dad told us reassuringly that none of us understood what it was like to lay your life down for your country, and that guys like him were deserving of a good deal on a place to stay. We didn't really have a say in what my dad decided to do, but I can tell firsthand that this elderly man seriously creeps me out. Besides just that, we were all a bit sour about my dad signing the lease with the guy because it also meant that we wouldn't be able to visit the lake house in the summer. Anyways, my parents could use the extra cash while putting us through college, so my sister and I got over it. Even though our parents trusted him to keep the place from burning down, they would periodically check in on him through a little prodding from the landscaper workers. Plus, my parents had to make sure he hadn't fallen or had any issues that had gone unnoticed. These indirect check-ins seemed like the perfect solution. We stayed out of his nose, but still got peace of mind. You might call that a little invasive, but this guy was getting a great deal on the place anyway. I guess an elderly, crusty guy in his twilight years couldn't really care less about occasional questions from laid-back landscapers now and then. It wasn't like he was going to be able to physically keep the lake house in shape by himself anyway. My dad reasoned that his rent at least covered the maintenance. Despite it looking like he'd been a decent tenant, that all went out the window when the maintenance guys pointed out his predatory behavior to my mom over the phone. They told my mom that while doing landscaping for the neighbors' yards, they'd often spot him sitting weirdly on the porch, staring at the children by the lake. They said they had caught him doing other things too that I don't really feel comfortable repeating. My mom was a real saint, and absolutely loathed the idea of a disfigured old man eyeing children while being a tenant in her beloved lake house. For months, she talked my dad's ear off about it until he couldn't take it any longer. I still remember my mom screaming at him about how irresponsible it was for us to be accommodating a potential predator. My dad finally cracked. When the end of the year-long lease was up, my dad tried to let him down easy. He had high respect for him as a veteran. My dad lied and told him that they planned on having some work done to the house that would leave him without electricity or plumbing for a few months. The guy left without too much of a fuss. It wasn't like the money my parents had made off of him was great. They assumed he'd be able to find another spot just fine. My mom told my dad to stop worrying about him so much. My mom wanted him out of there as quickly as possible, so we even paid the landscaping guys a little extra to help him grab his belongings. Admittedly, I was also kind of happy to see him gone. It had always felt weird that someone so strange had basically unlimited access to our house. Anyway, about a year after that, my younger sister graduated college, so my parents seized upon the opportunity, clocked in their sick days, and flew us out for a summer trip at the lake house. My parents had recently gotten a black lab mix named Bear, who my sister hadn't met yet, so she was especially thrilled. I'll skip all the irrelevant stuff, but by the time we actually made it to the house, the sun had just started setting, so we decided to leave Bear inside while we grabbed dinner in town. The house wasn't stocked with groceries or anything, so we didn't really have another option. Before we left, I noticed Bear was acting strange. His ears were perked up and he kept pacing, like he was waiting for something. I figured he was just restless from the long trip and brushed it off. We weren't gone long, just enough time to eat and let the heat die down. But when we stepped back inside, something felt off, like seriously off. Before I could say anything, I saw Bear. He was sprawled out at the foot of the stairs, panting hard. My sister screamed, and I realized there was blood smearing the floor beneath him. My mom immediately pulled out her phone, presumably to call 911. Without a word, my dad made his way into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I followed suit, and the two of us slowly made our way around the house, searching for the intruder. By the time we made it to the top floor, my dad motioned for me to stop. It took me a second, but I ultimately realized what he was looking at. The attic hatch was open. It wasn't wide open, just cracked, but enough that we could see the faint glare of a flashlight shining down. I'm not proud to admit it, but I was petrified in fear in that moment. If it weren't for my dad, I don't know what would have happened. Without hesitation, he yanked the hatch and started bounding up the ladder. I didn't follow this time, I was too scared. I listened, expecting to hear some kind of fight, but no such sound came. Instead, a few moments later, my dad climbed back down the ladder, seemingly calm. He whispered to me that it was our old tenant, and I could tell that he was really torn about what to do. My mom eventually came running up the stairs, and when she found out what was going on, she started screaming at the top of her lungs. My dad wanted to let the guy go, but my mom wasn't having it. She had called the police already anyway, so that was that. When the police arrived, they went up to the attic and carried the guy down the ladder. He looked like he was in really bad shape, and I could tell my dad had nothing but sympathy. The police found our house key on his person, which also angered my mom because my dad had told her that he had changed the locks. Luckily, Bear survived, although he was seriously injured. As awful a thing as that man had done, my dad refused to press charges no matter what my mom or sister said to convince him. That was actually one of the biggest fights my parents ever had, and I never understood why my dad had so much sympathy for someone who had literally stabbed his dog. This all took place about a year ago, and we haven't been back to the lake house since. I really hate to say it, but this experience seriously tainted my childhood image of that house. I can't say I want to go back anytime soon. This happened last summer. I was 20 years old. My name is Kevin. My friend James comes from a very wealthy family. His dad is like an IP lawyer who contracts with the US government or something. They've got a bunch of properties all over the country and a handful of international ones too. That's the kind of wealth I'm talking about. One of their houses is on a relatively large but overall pretty secluded lake. The lake itself isn't so big that you can't see the houses on the other side of it, but it would be a workout and a half swimming across the whole thing. James' parents were never around, so he pretty much had unlimited access to that house, and he often invited friends over, with permission of course. There's something about being out on the lake that makes you feel invincible. It's a different feeling than the beach for sure. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but there's more of an exclusive vibe to it. Hopefully I can be successful enough to afford one day. Like I said, the lake itself is pretty secluded. Big fancy houses line the perimeter, but most of them would usually sit dark and empty. A lot of them were vacation homes for people who barely even used them. It's honestly kind of a shame thinking about it. There are upsides to that though. James would throw the craziest parties there because there were usually no neighbors to call the police. This night was different though. It was just the two of us, having a more chill night. I won't get into it, but I had just broken up with my girlfriend of 3 years and I was in dire need of some bro time. We were having a few beers out on the dock when I noticed a light flicking across the lake. I can't remember exactly what time it was. At first, I thought it was just the sun perfectly reflecting off something into my eye, but even when I moved my head to the side, I could still see it. It was flashing like someone was turning a light on and off repeatedly. I told James, and the two of us became fixed on it, trying to figure out what it could be. At some point, we realized the flashing wasn't random. It was following a pattern. 3 short bursts, followed by 3 longer ones, followed by 3 short ones. I guess I'm dumb for not knowing this, but James snapped his fingers and said it was Morse code. I looked at him like he was crazy and asked him when in the world he had learned Morse code. He told me he didn't actually know it, but he knew what 3 short, 3 long, 3 short meant. SOS. I called BS and pulled out my phone, but to my surprise, he was actually right. Like I said, maybe I'm dumb for not knowing that, but I'm not really one for obscure knowledge anyway. The flashing continued for another minute or so, following that same pattern, before stopping abruptly. The two of us had just been staring at it the whole time. I really didn't know what to think. It could have been a joke, but there was always that chance that someone was actually in trouble. James immediately suggested calling the cops, but I reminded him that we'd been drinking and we weren't legal yet. I was honestly fighting a DUI charge at the time, so the last thing I needed was another run-in with the police. He wasn't thrilled about that answer, and I could tell he was torn about the situation. The two of us couldn't really think of a rational explanation besides a kidnapping or something along those lines. We thought it might have been someone who had fallen and needed help, but that didn't make any sense because they probably would have just called the police. We've always been those adventurous, delinquent type guys, so we decided it was worth checking out ourselves. If it turned out to be serious, we'd call the police then. We went back inside. James' brother had a bunch of switchblades lying around his room. He was kind of a weird kid. So we grabbed a few of them just for peace of mind. James said he was good to drive and that we should drive around the lake to that house, but I told him I really wasn't comfortable with that for obvious reasons. He joked about my situation and I laughed it off. If we weren't driving, there was only really one other option. The two of us walked back out to the yard and dragged James' dad's kayak into the water. We were laughing at first, enjoying the adventure of it all, but the further out we got onto the lake, the quieter we got. I think both of us realized how dumb of an idea it was, but neither of us wanted to be the one to spoil the fun. The sun had almost fully set at that point, and it was getting harder to see. It wasn't pitch black or anything. We had light from some of the lake houses to guide us, but it was still a bit unsettling. As we got closer, the house came into view. It was big like the others, but it was obviously not maintained very well. For starters, the dock was half collapsed, literally. Half of it was just sunken into the water. The flashing had also stopped, which was kind of a bad sign too. We had planned on just tying the kayak to the dock, but we obviously couldn't do that anymore given how unstable it looked. Luckily, the yard wasn't too high up above the water, so we beached the kayak on the yard instead, careful not to slip on the rocks. I felt the adrenaline rush start coming on. I could tell James was feeling the same thing. We looked up toward the house. The light had been coming from the second floor, that much we knew. James was freaking out at that point and insisted that we just leave and call the police. I told him we'd have to kayak all the way back to his house to even do that, as there was no service on the lake and that we need to connect to Wi-Fi. I reminded him that we had explored 1,000,000 abandoned buildings before, and this wasn't too different. He wasn't thrilled with that logic, but agreed anyway. Believe me, I know how dumb this was. Everyone I talk to about this shares that same opinion, but I've never been one to make good decisions, and neither is James. We didn't walk to the front door. That would have been suicide. Instead, we crept around the house until we found a window that was unlocked. The two of us silently slipped inside. The house was empty. Not just abandoned, but empty. Like stripped. There was no furniture and no junk in there either. To be frank, there was no signs that anyone had ever even lived there. The floors and walls were completely bare. We moved cautiously through the rooms, looking for the stairs. There was no one in sight, and all the rooms were just as empty as the first one had been. We finally found the stairs and slowly made our way up. I had made a mental note of where the window was, and we slowly walked down one of the hallways until we got to what I guessed was the room the light had been coming from. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing. I glanced over at James. He nodded, and I carefully pushed the door open. The room was empty, with the exception of one thing by the window. I tiptoed over to it and realized what it was. It was one of those old projectors, and it was facing the window. Alarm bells immediately started going off in my head. This was a trap. Someone had set this up deliberately. James must have realized the same thing, because I just heard him start sprinting back the way we had came, not even trying to be quiet. I turned without another thought and followed him. As we were running down the stairs, I heard a door, presumably a closet door, swing open from the room I had just been in, followed by rapid thumping sounds. We bolted down the stairs and back through the house to that first window. James jumped through and I was next. As I was climbing through, I heard those footsteps from behind me again, bounding down the stairs. I didn't even look. I just made it through the window and ran to catch up with James, who was already down by the lake's edge. As I was running to catch up to him, I heard him curse, and I quickly realized why. The kayak was gone. I turned, and from the side of the house, there was a person running toward us. I could barely process what I was seeing. He was fast. I couldn't get a good look at him, but he was big, definitely an adult. I pulled out my switchblade, ready to defend myself. I expected James to do the same, but instead, he turned and jumped straight into the lake, sneakers, hoodie, everything. I didn't even think, I just followed. The water was freezing, but I didn't care. I swam as fast as I could, trying to fight the burning sensation in my arms and legs. We swam toward the light from James' house, which looked like it was miles away. The swim felt endless, but on pure adrenaline, we made it. By the time we dragged ourselves onto James' dock, I thought I had hypothermia. I don't think I've ever been that cold in my life. We ran straight inside, locked every door, and called the police. It took them almost an hour to show up. It was honestly kind of outrageous. When they finally did, they went straight across the lake to investigate. They were over there for a while, but when they came back, they told us exactly what I expected to hear, that there was no one. They confirmed this house had been abandoned for years. No signs of recent occupancy, no footprints, no gear, no personal belongings, nothing. Just an empty house. They weren't happy with us. They gave us the whole "why didn't you call first" speech. James's parents were even more pissed when they found out. Let's just say I wasn't invited back to the lake house after that. James told me his parents were threatening to sue the town for allowing something like that to happen, and the police for refusing to investigate further. As for me, I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who was in that house, or why they set that trap, or what they planned to do if we hadn't run. I don't think I want to. Most of my friends agree that it was a trap, and think that whoever was planning the whole thing got cold feet until the last minute. I really don't want to think about what would have happened if they had gone through with whatever they were planning on doing. When I was 22, I started seeing a guy who I met on a dating app for a while. His name was Hunter. We went on like 4 dates in the span of a little over a month. At first, things seemed alright. Our first date was a quick coffee date, less than an hour. More of a screening process to make sure he seemed normal. Our second date was at a nearby bar for some drinks. We both got a nice buzz, and it was a nice time. Our third date was dinner, and this was when I started to question things. Question if I really clicked with his personality, or if I felt like there was something slightly off about him. The date ended with a kiss still, the first and only time we ever kissed, so I convinced myself that because I let him kiss me, things went alright. It wasn't until a couple weeks later that we went on our fourth and final date. We went out for drinks once again. However, this time, I went into it with a less excited mindset, and I was paying more attention to little quirks in his behavior that I realized were kind of unusual. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean, but some of his mannerisms just gave off antisocial and borderline creepy vibes. He started to drink way too much on this date as well, and he started getting really touchy-feely at the bar, trying to kiss multiple times. I'm not a fan of PDA, especially not when sitting at a bar with people next to me. I politely turned down his advances, and within a few minutes, I mentioned I was tired, heavily implying we should leave. He asked for the check, paid it, and then we grabbed our coats and left. As we were walking to our cars, he stopped me and very bluntly asked me if we could go home together. I said not tonight, I'm tired and have work tomorrow, which was a lie. He shockingly kept trying, saying he'd drive me to work tomorrow and such. I found it to be absurd whether he was drunk or not. I also wasn't a fan of him drunk driving home. I made the decision at that point that I wouldn't see him again. I went to my car in the parking lot across the street and started driving home slowly, just because I had a couple drinks in my system. I wasn't drunk, but I was still very cautious. I was also overly alert of my surroundings, looking around for cops, which perhaps is why I picked up on the fact that the same car was behind me still after I made at least 3 turns. And at a certain stoplight, I realized it looked like Hunter's car. I texted him, "Are you following me?" He texted back pretty quickly, saying, "Yes, I just want to make sure you get home okay." I called him, but he wouldn't pick up. This was so weird, and quite frankly creepy. I pulled over and texted him to stop following me, I'm fine. He stopped in the middle of the street for a second, I presumed to read my texts, and then he drove off past me. He didn't text back, not until I got home and was in bed. He said as follows, "I hope I didn't weird you out tonight. Sorry I got so drunk. Next time we should do something a little more low-key, like dinner at my place or something." I didn't answer. So the next morning, he followed up with, "Oh no, is the vibe dead?" I still decided to wait a bit to respond. Not even 2 hours later, he sends me a question mark. So I decided to reply now before it got worse. I said, "Hey, I had a great time getting to know you, but I just think our personalities don't click that much. I also really just want to focus on myself right now. I hope you understand." After this was when the angry texts started coming in. The worst of which being, "No, I don't understand. You strung me along for 4 dates to tell me that? How about you pay me back half of everything I bought for you then?" There were a few other angry texts that involved personal information, so I'm not going to include them, but they were enough to prompt me to block him. I thought this would be the end of it, but then I started receiving no caller ID phone calls non-stop. I ignored all of them until he finally seemed to get the message and stopped. The next day, when my parents weren't home, I got home from work to find a bouquet of flowers on the stoop along with a card. The card was an apology from Hunter, asking for a second chance. He somehow knew where I lived. That disturbed me. In his mind, he somehow must have thought that this would come off as charming or sweet, when in reality it was extremely alarming. I sent a long and final text to him to please not contact me anymore and never come to my house again, or I'd file for a restraining order. I kept his number blocked so I wouldn't see his response. I thought things would be over now, but I couldn't be more wrong. It was not long after this that I was home alone for the night. My parents' house is big, and I had a loft bedroom, which meant my bedroom was the highest point in the house. I awoke in the middle of the night to something. I wasn't sure what it was at first, but I felt as though I was hearing noises from downstairs. I tried my best to listen closely, and then I heard what was very obviously a door opening from outside my bedroom. One of the upstairs doors. Nobody was supposed to be home that night. Even in my haze from freshly waking up, I still immediately thought intruder. I crawled out of my bed onto the floor and shimmied under the bed. Before calling 911, I texted everyone in my family asking who was home. I heard some distant noises from somewhere in the home, one of the other bedrooms. And then my bedroom door opened, and footsteps came up the carpeted stairs. After they reached the top step, there was silence. The whole room is carpeted, so I couldn't hear any potential footsteps. And then I heard the drawers next to my bed begin opening. I held my mouth with my hands to mask my breathing. I could feel my heart racing. I heard a man's voice say, "God fucking damn it," under his breath. In that moment, I thought, wait, that might have sounded like Hunter's voice. I still didn't move, and I prayed my phone did not get any notifications now. I heard more rummaging sounds. He was going through my entire dresser. Then, I heard and felt the bed move as he sat down. I was staring at the outline of 2 shoes through the bed skirt. Even in the dark, it was visible. I don't know what he was doing on the bed, but he sat there for over 2 or 3 minutes before getting up, and I heard him say under his breath, "Fucking bitch." I heard all the drawers close, and then I heard footsteps walk back down the stairs, the door shutting, and then sounds of footsteps walking down the stairs to the living room. I called 911 now, and I still whispered into the phone just to be safe. I stayed on the line and stayed under the bed for 10 to 15 minutes until one of the police officers showed up, and I went down to meet them at the front door, and even that was tense. After letting him in, I told him everything he didn't already know from the phone call he responded to. As such, he did a sweep of the house, and during that another officer arrived, this one female, who also assisted in the search. It turned out every window was unlocked, and one of the windows, the dining room one, is big enough for someone to crawl through, though I don't think anyone ever pictured someone squeezing through the bush in front of the window and then crawling through it. I gave a verbal statement of everything. I was given a report number and they left. When my parents returned home the next day, they already knew everything from my texts and phone call with them. We went to the police station with my report number and gave as much information as possible, such as text screenshots, including him admitting he was following me home. They said they'd investigate, though without solid proof it was him inside the house, it was tricky. I think the case lost steam when I really didn't have any proof of anything. I did, however, successfully get a restraining order against him, and I was advised to never accuse him of having broken in, nor ever contact him again. He thankfully didn't, But from that point till the moment I moved out of my parents' house, I was always uncomfortable he would be creeping around outside. Even today, I sometimes fear he might find out where I currently live. I was in the 6th grade when this happened. This all started on the week of Halloween, when I would stay after school to help decorate a haunted house for my school's Halloween carnival. I often got to stay and fool around with some of my friends while getting awarded with pizza for helping decorate. Along with my friends, there was also this other kid who would stay late. I'll call him Chris. We had gotten along for the entirety of the time that we would stay after school, and he never once gave me any reason to feel uneasy around him. He was genuinely a funny and cool kid. But anyway, fast forward 2 weeks. I was suddenly approached by a group of girls in my grade who were all excited and had wide grins on their faces. I asked them what was going on, only for them to tell me that I had a secret admirer and that he would be texting me tonight. Now, I'd be lying to you if I told you that I wasn't excited, or at the very least curious about this. I wanted to know who. Later that night, when I was about to go to sleep, I got a notification from Messenger. It was the only app I had at the time that I always used to communicate with my parents whenever I was home alone. The message was from Chris. I had completely forgotten that I added him on Facebook on Halloween. I opened the message and it read, "Maya, I need to talk to you." I was concerned and quickly replied, "Yeah, what's going on? Everything okay?" To this day, I wish I hadn't replied. The typing bubbles appeared and stayed there for a good 2 minutes, which meant that he was still typing. It felt like forever until his message finally came through. I didn't expect what came next. In a long paragraph, he confessed his love for me and how I've been driving him crazy since Halloween. He also proceeded to explain how he tried to impress me during recess and phys ed with his soccer skills, but that I never seemed to notice him. He said that he was growing tired of being ignored, and it ended with, "I want you to notice me. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, will you be my girlfriend?" I cringed at every word. I stared at the message for a long time. What the hell, I barely even know this kid, and I drifted apart from him a long time ago. I was trying to come up with a way to let him down easily, as I didn't want to hurt his feelings. I told him I didn't like him like that, and that I wanted to just be friends. I could tell right away that he didn't like this answer. He kept asking me why, and I had to come up with a reason each time until he eventually stopped answering. The next morning was a nightmare for me. Some of his friends kept coming up to me and telling me that Chris wanted to kiss me, which he told the entire grade he wanted to do, and that he would do it even if it meant cornering me. Taking this as a threat, I decided to tell my teacher. She told me to stay inside during recess and lunch, and that if he ever got even close to me, to run right back to the classroom. This wasn't enough for me. I reported him to the principal, who told me he would do something right away, and this gave me some relief. I feel I should mention that I lived right across the street from my school, and everyone knew this, including Chris, which leads me to what happened next. Later on in the week, I was walking home from school. I hadn't even been inside my house for more than 2 minutes before I heard someone knocking on my front door. I peeked out the window just in time to see someone ducking behind a parked car across the street. It had to be Chris. He must have been following me. My mom opened the door to find a piece of paper on the floor, and not surprisingly, it was addressed to me. I read the note out loud, and it said there was a surprise waiting for me under the Cadillac in my driveway, which at the time belonged to my brother. My mom went to check, only to find nothing. But it was after this day, my brother's Cadillac stopped working. I still have no idea what Chris did to the car, but my brother was forced to sell it. Unfortunately, my nightmare doesn't end there. I was constantly harassed by Chris's friends telling me to give him a chance and that he would treat me right. There was even a moment when I caught Chris taking a picture of me walking home, and the only reason I saw him was because I barely heard the sound of an iPhone camera behind me. Who knows how many photos of me he had on his phone. And every morning I woke up to a message from him with something along the lines of, "I can't wait to see you at school," or "I bet you'll look beautiful today." The harassment and stalking were only getting worse, and it was making me fear for my safety, especially now that he knew where I lived. Finally, I got a call into the counselor's office and I felt relieved, expecting her to tell me that Chris was going to get in trouble or that the cops would get involved. Anything. Instead, what I heard was worse. The counselor proceeded to tell me that boys will be boys, that they do crazy things when they're in love, and that I shouldn't be mad about this. She told me I should feel flattered as this kind of stuff was bound to happen, and that the only thing I could do was to accept it and learn from it. At the time, I didn't see the problem with her words, as I genuinely believed her, but looking back on it now, this was an insane and disturbing thing to say to a 6th grader who was being sexually harassed and who was fearing for her safety almost every day. That afternoon, I came home from school telling my mom everything the counselor told me, and she was rightfully furious. I was called to the principal's office again that same week, this time with my mom present. I remember very clearly my mom telling the counselor and principal, "What are you waiting for something bad to happen to her before you do something?" She continued to ask why it was taking so long for something to be done. They both stayed silent. My mom ended it by threatening the counselor and telling her to never speak to me again unless she was present. But unfortunately, I don't think the school ever did punish Chris, which to this day enrages me. He basically got away with everything. It doesn't even end there. One night during the weekend, when my parents had gone shopping, I was about to go to bed after watching a YouTube video on my iPad, when I heard something at my window. Now, I'm on the 2nd floor, so this was especially strange. The only thing that hits my window are birds accidentally flying into it. I sat up listening. Then it happened again. It sounded as if someone had thrown something at the glass. Then it happened again and again. They were consistent thuds, and it was starting to freak me out. I finally got the courage to get up from my bed and see what it was. My heart dropped into my stomach when I opened the curtain and looked down to see Chris holding a handful of rocks, looking up at my window. He somehow had managed to figure out which window was mine. He was about to throw another when he noticed me. I could ever so slightly see that he was saying something, but I didn't stop to see what. I remember going to see if every window and door was locked, and thankfully everything was. When I returned to my room, I received 4 messages from Chris. "Why did you leave? I just want to talk. I'm sorry, all I wanted was a kiss. Please forgive me. You are not who I thought you were. Bye." I blocked him after that. Thankfully, I never had another incident, even though I had to see him throughout the entirety of my school years, from 6th grade to senior year. The last thing I heard about him was that he was arrested. God only knows for what. The saddest and scariest part of my story, though, is the fact that a counselor was comfortable with telling me that this kind of behavior was a compliment and a learning experience for me as a girl. I just hope that woman no longer works with children, and that I never have to see Chris again. I want to stay as anonymous as possible with this. This was a very serious occurrence that I have PTSD about, and unfortunately, it scarred me. I'm changing all towns and names in this story, so there's no way it gets traced back to me. I've been a very reclusive person most of my life. It started at a young age. Even in my early school years, my teachers would tell my parents I had antisocial behavioral problems. I would even be included in some of the, I guess you would say, special 20-minute classes for speech and behavior in elementary school. At the time, I didn't comprehend why I was being brought there while the rest of my class wasn't. Middle school was when the pressures of the social hell that school is really started to set in. Kids started forming their friend groups, and that only carried over into high school and got worse. I never had learning disabilities or anything. I just had social issues, which had gotten better as I've grown older, but I would still consider myself an awkward, introverted person. However, I've made my close friends, and I'm grateful for that. But now let's talk about girls. Of course, being a social recluse comes with having trouble with the ladies. Honestly, not to get too graphic, but it means something to my story. I lost my virginity at 21. That's a bit late, I'd say. This was at the age of 23. I moved out of my parents' place already. I had been working a high-paying job in my field for a couple of years at that point already, and I bought a townhouse in my hometown. It was pretty affordable, but a nice and big townhouse. I don't live there anymore, but it was 2 floors. It was the kind of place that would impress girls at 23 if you owned it. So one day swiping on Tinder, I matched a pretty decent-looking girl. I'll call her Emily. We went on a date at a nearby restaurant for dinner. I was a little in my head, thinking she was judging me or I was acting awkward, and by the end of it, I felt like she'd never want to see me again. But when I was in bed after getting home, she told me she really liked me and had fun, and I was ecstatic, honestly. So we went on a second, third, and fourth date, and honestly, things felt great after I got out of my head. We became boyfriend-girlfriend fairly quickly, but the honeymoon phase didn't last forever. When you first start seeing someone, you get excited anytime they text or call you. You crave the attention because ideally it's a two-way thing. But slowly, I started feeling as though she was texting me maybe a bit too much. At all times of the day, she'd ask where I was, if I was doing something, or perhaps took my time in responding. She'd call me or send question marks to follow up. One day when we were on the couch, she demanded we share our locations with each other. I wasn't thrilled about this, even though I had nothing to hide. I did it anyway. So we're a couple months into the relationship, our location shared, and this is where things went really sour. She'd start asking me why I was at Phil's house and not answering her texts. It got so bad that one night when I was with Phil and my friend Mark in Phil's basement on a Friday night, she actually showed up to his house, and Phil's mom walked Emily downstairs. She didn't even hide the fact that she was pissed at me, and immediately spoke in a loud voice, almost a yell, reprimanding me for goofing around at Phil's house instead of answering her texts about going to some winery the following day. I asked her if we could discuss this later, but she insisted I leave with her. I apologized to my friends and went outside with her. We had an argument in the street. She wanted to come home with me, but I told her no. We both drove separately, obviously, so I drove home and told her not to follow me. When I got home, I sent her a long text telling her we need a break and I need space. Should I have done this in person? Yeah, probably. Text message breakups aren't fair most of the time. But honestly, in the moment, I was scared of what her reaction would be in person. Of course, she started calling me over and over, blowing up my phone with texts. When I eventually stopped answering, I got aggressive pounds at my front door of my townhouse and constant rings from the doorbell. It got so bad that my neighbor actually came out and asked her what she was doing. I heard Emily screaming at him that I'm a piece of shit and this and that, and my neighbor calmly told her to go home. I listened to everything with my ear basically up to the door. She did leave, and honestly, I was kind of disturbed. I'm not saying the crazy just came out of nowhere, there were definitely signs, but I was blind to some of it because of the honeymoon effects. The next day, I remembered to stop sharing my location with her, and immediately, as if she were obsessively checking our texts, she angrily blows me up for doing that. I was more and more sure of my decision to cut ties with her every text she sent. My final text to her was, "I'm sorry, Emily, I have to block you for a while, you're scaring me." She surprisingly didn't come knocking or anything. However, I noticed she instantly stopped sharing her location as well. It was exactly 1 week later. I went over to Phil's house again and chilled with the guys. I left around 11 p.m. and got home shortly after. I wasn't tired and I was hungry, so I threw some food in the microwave and plopped on the couch to watch a movie. I was browsing all the streaming apps for something good. I wanted a scary movie. When the microwave beeped and it went silent, I suddenly heard a click or thud from the dining room. So the layout of the downstairs of the townhouse, it looped around in a circle. It went from the kitchen to dining room to living room to den, and they were all separated by a wall in the middle. However, the den to the dining room had a door, not an opening. I attached this photo to give a better idea. To allow for complete silence, I grabbed the TV remote and muted the TV, and it was then that I surely heard the door separating the den and the dining room clicking open. I peered into the dining room. I blurted out, "Who's in here?" to of course nothing in response. I entered the dining room, my blood running cold as I saw that door was opened. I have a thing for keeping doors in my home shut, and that door was no exception. I went to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife from the knife block. I also called 911 right away. I had never called 911 once in my life. This was a first. On the phone, I spoke really loud so that whoever was in there would hear that I was on the phone with the police. Whether this was a good idea or not, I guess is debatable. I said, "I think my crazy ex-girlfriend has broken into my house. Please send someone." The rest of that call was explaining what exactly was going on, why I thought it was my ex, and her instructing me to wait outside if possible. So I went outside and waited not far from the front door. Surprisingly quickly, a police car rolled up. I once again briefly explained what I thought was going on, and I led the officer into my home. We both performed the most thorough search of the place together, and I'm telling you, no one was in there. We checked the mini crawl space hidden in the closet. We checked every closet for that matter. We checked under the beds, under the couches, even the mini attic too. When the coast was quite literally clear, he told me to call again if I heard anything, which said to me that he believed me and knew I wasn't making it up or going crazy. My night was obviously disturbed after that. No way I was going to be able to sit in the living room and watch a movie now. I ate my food, which had been sitting in the microwave, and went up to my room and locked the door. I texted all my friends and family, of course, about how spooked I was, but given that no one was in there, I had to dismiss it as just one of those creepy moments of something in the house moving by itself. I almost texted Emily, but refrained from doing so. I took a melatonin, and from what I remember, I quickly drifted off to sleep surprisingly. However, I'm a light sleeper, and something caused me to wake up. I didn't know what it was, but something in the room felt off. I checked my phone, and I had a bunch of texts from a random number. That must have been what woke me up. I quickly realized it was Emily. In short, without reading the paragraph she sent me, she was stating how sorry she was and that she wanted to talk. She was begging me to see her to talk tomorrow in person, and the rest of the texts were her saying, "Are you awake?" and "Wake up" over and over. She said "wake up" a total of 8 times over text. Surprisingly, she hadn't tried calling me though. I responded, "Why are you awake right now? This is crazy that you're blowing me up at an hour like this. Honestly, if I wasn't sure before, your actions just these past few days alone have confirmed that I don't want anything to do with you anymore. Please just leave me alone." Seconds after I pressed send, I heard a scream from inside of the closet next to my bed. It was Emily's voice, yelling the word "no," and then the closet door burst open. I didn't have time to think of anything besides jumping out of the bed and getting that bedroom door open and getting out of the room. It wasn't locked anymore, mind you. Once out of the room, I pushed the door shut and held it shut as she tried opening the door. She didn't just try opening it though. She started stabbing the door, and I saw the knife she was wielding piercing through my side. In the moment, I decided to scream, "Baby, I love you, stop," instead of something like, "You're sick and you need help." When I said I loved her, she stopped and calmed down, and I took this moment to call 911 again silently while still holding the door shut. At this moment, we spoke through the door to each other while I had 911 on the line, and I came up with some bullshit on the spot that I was going through a rough time right now, but that I loved her and was planning on getting back with her. She said in a frantic voice, "That's all I wanted to hear, why couldn't you just be honest with me?" She asked me to open the door. I had to stall though. I told her I was scared and wanted her to drop the knife. Eventually, she agreed, and I told her to throw it across the room so I could hear it land. She did so. I heard the clang of the knife ricocheting off the wall and onto the floor. So what I did next, I yanked the door open and tackled Emily to the floor. She screamed and fought and went hysterical. I didn't care. I held her down as I yelled my address and everything into the phone, which was still connected to 911. I held her down all the way until the police arrived. To my surprise, the police literally kicked the front door down, and it was so loud it could be heard over Emily struggling all the way upstairs. Police entered the room quickly, a surprising amount of police actually. Emily was put in cuffs quickly, and she was hysterically crying. I think the only reason I wasn't crying was because I was in such shock. This was the worst, most scarring night of my life. The nightmare didn't end there though. There was such a long and serious legal process that followed as far as getting Emily convicted. I never wanted my name or any info to be out there on the internet to end up on one of those crime YouTube channels, so I've been careful about leaking too much information that could get back to me. Emily's in prison for some very serious charges. No part of that makes me happy. This was someone I spent a little chunk of my life with more or less every day. Someone I thought I loved. Someone who tried to kill me. She was not right in the head, and it still pains me how oblivious I was, not only because of how infatuated I became at first, but because of my own lack of self-confidence to a degree that I was so focused on impressing her at first that I didn't even pay attention to certain alarming behaviors on her part early on. I know this will stick with me forever, and honestly, even if anonymously, it would feel good to get this story out there finally if it's chosen to be read. I don't live much of an exciting life, but whenever people ask me for a scary story, this is the one I tell. I was 15 at the time, about to start my sophomore year of high school. I grew up in a typical beach town, packed with tourists during the summer, but a ghost town as soon as the season ended. The bars and restaurants all closed down, and it's just the locals, the sky, and the ocean. If you've never been down the shore during the off-season, I would strongly recommend it. It's one of the strangest, yet most calming feelings you can get from this life. As cliche as it sounds, our house is on a street called Surf Avenue, and it's only a block from the beach. Funny enough, I know how to surf. It would honestly be pretty pathetic if I lived on a street called Surf Ave without even knowing how to do it. I'd lived there my whole childhood, so the boardwalk and sand had always been a part of my routine. Damn near part of my personality, to be honest. I don't live in that specific house anymore, but the property has stayed in the family, so it still feels like a piece of me. At the time, I was on my high school varsity's cross-country team, and I was kind of obsessive about staying in shape, even during the off-season. Summers get insanely hot down the shore, so I usually ran super early in the morning or late at night, times when I wouldn't melt in the heat or have to be that jerk weaving in between crowds. That night, I decided to go for a late night run. I'd stayed up pretty late with some friends the night before and slept in that morning, so I kind of had no choice. I never brought my phone with me when I ran. It was always annoying not having music, but even that little bit of extra weight would be enough to throw me off. I don't know if they still make them anymore, but I had this rinky-dinky little Garmin watch that I used to track distance and pace. Besides that, the only other thing I'd carry was my house keys. To put it mildly, my parents were incredibly uptight about keeping the house locked, so as annoying as it was, I really had no choice but to stuff my house keys in my shorts pocket every time I went for a run, even if they were home. It was one of those non-negotiable rules. I still don't really understand why my parents were so concerned about it, especially because most private beach towns are typically super safe, but that's neither here nor there. I decided to stick to the boardwalk that night. The surface was just soft enough to be easy on my legs, but not as brutal as running on the sand. Sometimes I'd jog on the beach for a challenge, but that wasn't happening after the day I'd had. I just wanted a nice, easy long run with minimal changes in elevation or terrain. The boardwalk would give me just that. I started zoning out after a few miles, enjoying that euphoric runner's high. I always tell people, even today, if you could break that first mental barrier, which occurs after about 3 miles or so, the rest of the run is easy and borderline enjoyable. Anyway, I was listening to the slap of my shoes against the wood while simultaneously trying to concentrate on the distant sounds of the ocean. I was in that perfect rhythm where you forget you're even running, but then I heard it. A faint clink. I stopped and checked my pocket. Empty. My stomach dropped. It was my keys. I crouched down, peering through the gaps in the boardwalk, but it was useless. It was pitch black under there, and there was no way I'd even be able to retrieve them from where I was. I started cursing, literally yelling out loud. I know that sounds a little silly, but the adrenaline was still pumping through me from the exercise, and I was pissed that this detour had ruined my run. I knew my parents would have killed me if I came back without those keys, so without really thinking, I jumped off the side and headed down to the sand. It was also partly a matter of pride. I wasn't just going to walk away from one of my personal belongings. Who does that? The smell under the boardwalk hit me instantly. It was like rotten seaweed mixed with stale beer. That's honestly the best way to describe it. Imagine literally filling a bathtub with seaweed and beer. It was damp and heavy, and every step I took, I kicked up sand and trash. Like I said before, I didn't have my phone with me, so the backlight on my watch was the only thing guiding me, and it wasn't doing much. I crouched down to the spot where I thought my keys had fallen. They were nowhere in sight, just more clumps of sand and scraps of garbage. I'll repeat myself, it was disgusting, but I needed those keys. I thought about just leaving them, but decided that I had gotten this far, and turning back now would mean I had gotten covered in garbage and stench for nothing. I tried shifting the sand around a bit, thinking maybe they had fallen beneath the surface, but after a few minutes, frustration started to creep in. Had I really misjudged the spot by that much? I concluded that that was the most rational explanation, that I had somehow misjudged where they had fallen. I climbed back up to the boardwalk, stood where I had stopped running, and thought about how I could be sure of the spot underneath. That's when I got this genius idea to use my shoelace as a marker. I knelt down, untied it, and slipped it between the planks, letting it hang. That way, I could crawl back under the boardwalk and spot it from below easily. As I was standing back up, something tugged on the lace and it instantly disappeared into the crack. Not a breeze, not me moving weirdly, something from below. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was literally in shock. Someone had pulled it. I took a step back and stared at the spot where my shoelace had just been. There was someone underneath the boardwalk. I instantly put two and two together. Whoever was under there probably had my keys too. My first instinct was to run home and figure it out later, but the thought of someone having my house keys, knowing where I lived, made my blood boil. Our house address was etched into them, so I couldn't just leave some stranger with that kind of access. I still don't know why I did it. Call it stupid teenage confidence, but I took a deep breath, jumped back into the sand, and crawled under again. It felt different the second time. The air felt heavier, and I was bracing myself for some kind of fight. At one point, I heard faint shuffling somewhere ahead of me. My chest tightened. I swung my watch light toward the sound, but saw nothing, just more sand and beams. I kept moving, and I heard shuffling again, this time from a different direction. That's when I realized the noise wasn't coming from one spot. There were multiple people under there. That was enough for me. Common sense struck me in the face like a freight train. What in the world could I have possibly expected to happen? Was I just gonna fight some crackhead living under the boardwalk? That was suicide. I turned to get out of there, trying not to panic. But before I could make it all the way out, something cold latched onto my ankle. It was a hand. I screamed in pain as fingernails dug into my skin. I didn't think. I just kicked as hard as I could. My foot connected with something, and whoever was holding onto my ankle let go. I scrambled away, my legs and arms scraping against the sand and wood as I pushed myself out into the open air. I didn't stop running. I sprinted straight back to my house. When I reached the front door, I pounded on it until my dad opened up. To say he was pissed would be a massive understatement. He was livid. I was surprised he didn't get physical with me. Before he could fully flip out, I explained everything: the keys, the shoelace, the people under the boardwalk. The commotion woke my mom up, who was furious at first, but when she saw the marks on my ankle, her expression shifted to something closer to fear. My dad didn't waste time. He called the police, and the next morning, we had a locksmith come out and change all the locks on the house. For a couple of days, things felt normal again. I figured that was the end of it, just a weird, messed up night that I'd try to forget. But then, a few mornings later, I woke up to loud knocking at the front door. It was early, way too early for visitors. I sat in bed for a while, waiting for my parents to go deal with it. When neither of them did, I decided to do it myself, so I pulled on a hoodie and went downstairs. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one there. Confused, I opened the door, looking around. There was no one in sight. I glanced around the street, no cars, no people. Right when I was about to close the door, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Sitting on the doormat was a shoelace. My shoelace. The one from that night. I slammed the door shut without another thought. We got a security system installed that afternoon. For weeks afterwards, my family lived in constant fear, but nothing ever happened after that. When I think back to this experience, I still can't rationalize the events that took place. Even though I don't live in that house anymore, it still kind of creeps me out that some random stranger knows where our beach house is. The thing about living in a beach town during the off-season is that it feels deserted. The tourists are long gone, the storefronts are mostly boarded up, and the boardwalk, the heart of the town in the summer, is nothing but an empty skeleton of itself. I like it though. It's peaceful. That's why for the longest time I go for late night runs on the boardwalk in the off-season, when no one was there. It was my detox from life and all the stresses that come with it. Sometimes you just need to be away from people. There was something about the sound of the waves and the rhythmic slap of my sneakers against the wooden planks that calmed me. It made me feel like I had the whole world to myself. Tonight was no different. The air was crisp, carrying that scent of salt and damp wood. The only lights came from the occasional street lamp, buzzing faintly, casting long, lonely shadows. I was maybe a mile in when I got that feeling, the one where you just know you're not alone. I glanced over my shoulder. A man stood in the distance, not walking, not moving, just standing there on the boardwalk facing me. I swallowed and turned back around, shaking it off. It was probably nothing, maybe just another local taking a walk. But honestly, no matter what, that's still going to be an eerie sight to see. I kept running, but a few minutes later, the feeling of being followed or watched came back even stronger. My heart thudded more intensely, not from exertion, but something else. The curiosity to turn around again thickened, so I turned around again. He was closer, still not moving, still just standing there, facing me. A deep, crawling unease settled in my stomach. I picked up the pace, now taking out my one headphone that I had in. My feet pounded against the wood, breath coming quicker, but every few moments, I heard footsteps behind me, in sync with mine. I turned again. He was even closer, but still, he was completely still. I broke into a sprint. The once soothing boardwalk felt like an endless trap, stretching too far in both directions. My car was at the very end, parked right by the beach entrance. I just had to make it there. I ran harder than I ever had before. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I refused to stop. Every few seconds, I turned my head just enough to check, and every single time, he was a little closer, still standing and still watching. I didn't understand how he was able to stop so suddenly every time I turned around. I wasn't even looking where I was going anymore, just focused on getting away. The boardwalk exit finally came into view, and I nearly sobbed in relief when I saw my car. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely press the unlock button. Finally, the lights flashed, and I yanked the door open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut. I turned the key in the ignition and backed the car out of the spot. When I put the car in drive to whip the wheel to the left to turn out of there, I looked ahead, and the man was standing directly in front of my car, right where my car had just been. But I looked at him so briefly that I didn't even have time to make out any features. All I saw was that he had his hood up, covering a decent chunk of his face. I cranked the wheel to the left and almost spun out as I whipped my car out of there. The entire way home, I didn't care if I ran a red light, if I swerved, or if I nearly spun out. I just drove. I didn't look back. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, every possible entrance. I didn't sleep that night, and I've had a couple of nightmares referencing that experience, both in which that man appeared in some form, watching me or chasing me. My mind created its own versions of what he looked like, I guess, since I really didn't see his face, and they were not pretty images. I haven't done a winter run on the boardwalk since then. This happened last summer. I was 22, spending a weekend at the shore with a bunch of friends in the cheapest Airbnb we could find. It was the last night of our stay. We'd been out on the beach all night with a bonfire, just hanging out, drinking, and talking. Nothing crazy. By the end, most of my friends were ready to call it, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd walk off the buzz for a bit and then find my way to the Airbnb after that. The boardwalk at night has this weird peacefulness to it. Everything's empty. I haven't spent much time at the beach, so it was all very new and interesting to me. After wandering around for a while, I realized I really had to pee. I'm not really the type of guy to just do it in public, which is something my friends often make fun of me for, so this was a bit of an issue. I spotted one of those public boardwalk bathrooms, old, beat up, and barely lit. Not ideal, but I didn't feel like holding it until I got back. I pushed the door open and immediately regretted it. The place smelled awful, like a mix of bleach and whatever it was trying to cover up. I figured I'd make it quick, so I went to the farthest stall. That's when I heard the door creak open again. I winced, annoyed that I'd no longer have privacy. I listened as their footsteps slowly walked around. They seemed to be circling the bathroom, which was kind of odd. At times, I thought the footsteps were coming from multiple directions, like there was more than one person, but I wasn't sure. Eventually, they stopped near the sinks. Just stopped. No movement, no coughs, nothing. The water didn't turn on either, so I wasn't really sure what they were doing. I finished up, ready to get out of there, but when I went to push the stall door open, it didn't budge. I jiggled the latch, but the door was still stuck. I wanted to punch the stall door. That's how angry and uncomfortable I was. But then the footsteps started again. They were closer this time, and I got this really knotty feeling in my chest. It felt like someone was holding the door shut. I tried to shove the door with my shoulder, but still nothing. The adrenaline was starting to kick in, and a part of my brain began connecting the dots. I decided I wasn't just going to sit there like some helpless target. I charged the door with all the force I could muster, and it finally gave way, sending me stumbling out. As I burst out of the stall, I noticed the bathroom door swing shut, like someone had just walked out. I scanned the bathroom, which was now empty. That person who had been walking around in there was seemingly gone. I hastily washed my hands and went to get out of there. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The handle wouldn't even turn, as if the bathroom had somehow been locked from the outside. I froze. My mind was racing at that point. Was this some kind of prank? I thought it was maybe one of my friends screwing with me, but that didn't really make sense. They had all left already. They didn't even see where I had gone. Plus, this wasn't really something any of them would do. Either way, I was pretty freaked out at that point, so I just gritted my teeth and started banging on the door. I yelled for whoever was out there to open up, but I didn't get a response. Just then, I heard movement in one of the stalls behind me. I whipped my head around, and even though I couldn't see anything, I knew there was a person in one of those stalls. That meant there had been 2 people in there the whole time. I didn't see any feet under any of the doors, so they must have been standing on one of the toilets, which was even more concerning. I thought about calling the police, but I needed to get to safety first. I was in danger. I noticed a grimy window up near the ceiling. It wasn't big, but I didn't have another option. I climbed onto the sink beneath it, which I literally thought was going to break under my weight, and I shoved the window open. As I was halfway out the window, one of the stall doors burst open behind me, and I locked eyes with a man. He was really hairy and the palest skin I've ever seen. He was dressed like a teenager, but this guy had to be like 50 years old. I didn't waste another second. I scrambled the rest of the way through the window and dropped down onto the boardwalk. My knee hit the ground hard, but I didn't care. I just ran. When I got a safe distance away, I called the cops. They showed up pretty quickly. It was a beach town after all, but by the time they checked the bathroom, that guy was long gone. That part of the boardwalk was dead. No cameras, no shops open that late, so it's not like there were any cameras they could check. I showed the officers where everything had gone down, and one of them pointed to the scratches on the bathroom door handle, saying it looked like someone had messed with it. We all agreed whoever it was didn't want me leaving, which was not the most comforting thing. The officers told me I was smart to escape through the window, and that was that. I had to leave the beach the next day, so I never got any kind of update on the situation. I doubt the police even really investigated much anyway. I'm sorry in advance if I mess up some details of the story, but it happened when I was really young. I don't remember exactly how old I was when it happened, maybe 8 or 9, but I know it was during one of those summers my family spent at my grandparents' beach house. It was kind of like the family hub. Every summer, a bunch of us, my siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, would pile in for weekends or weeks at a time. The house wasn't super fancy or anything, but it had like 1,000,000 bedrooms and could sleep our whole family easily. It was also really close to the beach, so I used to spend entire days playing in the sand and exploring the neighborhood on my bike. Every summer I spent there was amazing. It still feels like an extended fever dream, especially now as I'm getting further and further removed from that blissful childhood. I remember that summer being different though. There was some big hurricane forecasted, one that had all the beach towns scrambling to take precautions months in advance. I'm not sure if other beach towns did this, but ours built these massive sand dunes along the shore as a makeshift barrier. I'm not sure if calling them dunes is exactly accurate. They were huge. I mean, to a kid, they looked like castle walls. I bet the aerial view of the coast during that time would have looked absolutely nutty. That summer, my siblings and I would spend hours climbing the dunes, tumbling down the other side, pretending we were scaling mountains or sneaking into a fortress. It was weird though, as you could probably imagine. Usually when you're standing on the boardwalk facing the beach, you can see the ocean stretching out in front of you. But those dunes, they completely block the view. You'd walk along the boardwalk, and instead of water, there was just this giant wall of sand. The beach also closed after a certain hour, like the lifeguards would go off duty and people weren't technically permitted to go on the beach, but that never really stopped us locals. The town was safe, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and letting kids roam wasn't considered a big deal, especially after the touristy crowds thinned out. As long as we promised not to go in the ocean, our parents didn't really mind. And to be honest, I was kind of a little troublemaker back then. I liked pushing boundaries, especially when I thought I could get away with it. That's what led me to sneak out that evening. It wasn't dark yet, the sun hadn't even started setting, but I hadn't asked permission to go out. I just wanted some alone time. I think I'd gotten into a fight with one of my brothers, but I don't really remember. The sliding door downstairs where all the kids' bedrooms were made it easy to come and go unnoticed. My older cousins had practically written the playbook on sneaking in and out, usually for way more rebellious reasons than a solo beach walk, but I'd learned from them. Even today, we still laugh about how easy it was to sneak people in and out of the house without alerting the adults. Anyway, as quietly as I could, I stepped outside my bare feet, not even bothering to put shoes on. I made my way toward the boardwalk, expecting to encounter some locals, maybe even some kids my age. Even after beach hours, there were usually people around. Anyone who had or was staying in a house down there, really. I was kind of surprised to see how empty it was. It was a little strange. I'm talking not a single soul outside. It felt deserted in all honesty. I walked along the boardwalk for a little while, half expecting to see someone, but I never did. It was literally like the whole beach was asleep that night or something. I was about to head back when I noticed something alarming. There was a thin trail of smoke rising from beyond one of the dunes. At first, I thought it was just fog, but I took a closer look and confirmed that it was smoke. Like smoke from a fire kind of smoke. Smoke on the beach wasn't that unusual, even though it was really against beach rules and borderline illegal. Sometimes tourists lit bonfires. But there was something about how empty everything was that night that made the smoke feel wrong. To my mind, it kind of looked like a volcano, as the smoke sort of just emanated from the sand dune. I looked around for an adult, but there was no one. Just the empty boardwalk stretching out in both directions. I should have gone home, but curiosity got the better of me. Plus, my parents had taught me to never turn my back on someone in need, and this situation kind of felt like that. I climbed the sand dune a little ways away from the smoke. By the time I reached the top, I was covered in sand. I looked down the other side and saw what I expected to see, a bonfire. The weird thing is that it was completely isolated. There was no one around. There were no chairs, no coolers, nothing. Just a fire burning in the middle of an empty beach, as if whoever had set it had abandoned it. It didn't sit right with me. Even at that age, I knew leaving a fire like that was dangerous. I slid down the dune and made my way over to it. I stood there for a second, just staring at it. I didn't know what else to do, so I just started kicking sand onto it. I did that over and over until the flames were finally suffocated. I didn't want to leave it just yet. I was way too curious. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would light a fire just to abandon it, unless they were trying to commit a crime or something. I inspected the fire pit some more and made some eerie discoveries. First, there were clothes. Little kids' clothes, like stuff that I'd wear. Kids' shoes, socks, half-burned fabrics. I bent down, using a stick to poke around. I realized that the fire had mostly been clothes, which gave me a really sick feeling inside. But then I realized what else had been burning. Photos, or at least what was left of them. Most were charred beyond recognition, but one had survived enough for me to make out a face. It was a boy, probably around my age. He honestly looked a little bit like me, like if one of my parents told me he was a distant cousin or something, I'd believe them. The picture made me really scared. I felt myself wanting to run, and I dropped the stick I was holding. I was just a little kid. I obviously hadn't been through anything that scary before, so I was really freaking out. But it got so much worse. I heard a voice shout out, "Hey," from somewhere in the distance. I looked up, and there was a man coming toward me from down the beach. He was bald, but I couldn't see much else of his face from so far away. He was also staggering every few steps, as if he were fighting not to trip over on his own feet. It looked like he was drunk, or something worse. He yelled, "Hey kid," and started moving a little more quickly towards me. I couldn't move. I was frozen to the spot, petrified in fear. He yelled, "Don't you go anywhere," and that was what did it for me. My little brain finally caught up to my body, and I started running towards the sand wall. The sand made running hard, but I felt like I was in a life and death situation. I started climbing the dune, and I could hear him yelling obscene things behind me. He was getting closer. Just as I reached the top, I felt fingernails clawing at my ankle. By some miracle, he was never able to get a grip on me, and I vaulted myself over the dune, tumbling down to the bottom. I sprinted for the boardwalk and ran all the way home. I looked back a few times to make sure he wasn't following me, which he wasn't, but I kept running like my life depended on it. When I got home, I immediately went to my bedroom and started crying. I wanted to tell my parents, I really did, but all I could think about was how I'd snuck out and how much trouble I'd be in, so I kept my mouth shut. Looking back, I know I should have said something. I should have told my parents at least, but I didn't, and nothing ever came of it. As far as I know, there were no news reports, no police at the beach the next day, no reports of missing children in the area, or anything like that. I still don't know what to make of this. Even though it happened a long time ago, I can't help but feel like there's more to the story. I think what terrifies me the most is how eerily similar that kid in those photos looked to me. Sometimes I wish I could go back in time and tell my younger self to just fess up, but that's just something I'll have to live with. When I first came to the United States, I was 20 years old and working as an au pair. I didn't have much experience, but I was eager, also very nervous. I'd grown up in a small town in France and hadn't ever spent time away from home, let alone across an ocean. My English still needed work, but I was confident enough to get by. I expected it to be a good year, a new adventure, a cultural exchange, something I'd tell my friends about when I went home. I was matched with the Joseph family. I don't want to name the exact town for privacy reasons, but it was an upper middle class neighborhood. Quiet streets, nice houses, big backyards, the kind of place you'd expect to find well-behaved kids, PTA moms, and dads who worked non-stop. I remember being so relieved when I first arrived. I thought this would be easy. Nothing bad happens in places like this. The Josephs had 2 boys, Brock and Brandon. Brock, the older one, was 12. He was a pretty typical kid, kind of lazy, sometimes rude, but harmless overall. He made jokes, liked his Xbox, and mostly stayed out of trouble. Brandon, though, was different. He was 9 and already had this coldness to him. I don't know how else to describe it. There was something off. I think it's likely he had some kind of social disorder. When I first met him, he just stared at me without saying a word. Not shy or embarrassed, just staring like he was studying me. After a few seconds, he smiled and asked, "Are you the maid?" I laughed awkwardly and said I was going to help look after him and his brother for the year. He didn't laugh with me, he just kept watching. It didn't take long to realize Brandon wasn't like the other kids. My host parents warned me that he was difficult. They said he had a bit of an attitude, but that was the understatement of the century. Brandon didn't just have an attitude, he was mean. And I don't mean the usual bratty stuff like teasing his brother or refusing to eat what he was served. It was worse than that. He lied constantly, about everything. He once told his teacher that Brock tried to choke him in the kitchen, which never happened. He told a neighbor that his parents locked him in a closet at night. He even told me that the last au pair ran away because of him, and that she was never seen again. When I tried to scold him for it, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't tell me what to do." Everything was manageable for me, even at that point, but I do admit that I was a little frightened of him. Things only got worse from there. One night, about 2 months in, I pulled back my sheets and froze. There were thumbtacks scattered all over my mattress. I just stared for a second. Dozens, maybe 100 of them, were pointing upwards, waiting for me to lie down. My heart started racing. The mattress cover had tiny punctures everywhere. I stood there in fear, realizing how close I'd come to lying on them. Brandon had been spying on me earlier that day. I'd caught him peeking through a crack in the door when I was folding clothes. I didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed he was being nosy. But after seeing all those thumbtacks, I wasn't so sure. I was honestly so scared. I didn't want to tell his parents, afraid that they'd send me back to France, so I cleaned up the mess and kept it to myself. After that, things became more and more strange. Brandon started following me around the house. I'd catch him peeking around corners, watching me from the doorways. Sometimes when I was cooking or reading, I'd look up to find him sitting across the room, staring without blinking. I never said anything. I must admit, I tried to avoid him as much as I could out of fear. One afternoon, I was watering flowers in the garden when I smelled something off. A sharp, sour odor, like something rotting. I traced it to a corner of the yard where the soil looked freshly disturbed. I was curious, so I grabbed one of those little garden shovels and started poking at the soil. When I saw what was there, I nearly screamed. There were 3 dead rabbits buried there. Their bodies were twisted and cut in several places. One had its legs tied together with string. I ran inside to tell my host parents. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph looked concerned at first, until they pulled Brendan aside to ask him about it. He gave an innocent look and said it wasn't him. And that was it. They believed him. Mrs. Joseph said it was probably one of the neighborhood kids and told Brendan to go back inside. I started sleeping with my bedroom door locked after that. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow near my bed. It was Brandon. He was standing there, holding something. I blinked a few times and realized what it was. A kitchen knife. I screamed as loud as I could. By the time the parents came rushing in, the knife was gone. Brandon had shoved it onto the bed. He convinced them that he'd been sleepwalking. Mrs. Joseph gave me an annoyed look, as if to say, "Why are you making such a fuss?" I pointed to the knife handle sticking out from under the bed and pleaded with them to believe me. Mr. Joseph knelt down, pulled it out, and showed it to Brandon. He just smiled and said he had never seen it before, and they of course believed him. I told them that my door had been locked, so he must have picked it, but they told me that was nonsense. I felt so alone. I had no one. I didn't know what to do. For better or worse, a decision was made for me. The next morning, Mrs. Joseph called me to the living room and said I had stolen her jewelry. I was completely confused until she held up a pearl necklace I had never seen before. She told me she had found it in my purse, which she was holding in her other hand. I begged her to believe me, that I hadn't stolen it, but there was nothing I could say to convince her. Brandon stood in the hallway smiling to himself. I knew it was him. They fired me on the spot. I flew back to France the next day. I couldn't believe how easily Brandon had destroyed my life. For months afterwards, I was extremely depressed. I thought I had blown my one chance at living in the US and feared I wouldn't get another one. Fortunately, I found my way back to the States several years later and still live here. I have a good job and good friends. I still think about Brandon from time to time. I can only imagine the evil person he's grown up to become. For most people, traveling alone is terrifying, and understandably so. For some reason, it's never bothered me all that much. I've always been quite independent and outgoing, so befriending new people comes naturally to me. It's probably one of the reasons I decided to become an au pair. Also, I've always wanted to become a child psychologist. In my opinion, one of the world's problems could be solved if children had better parenting and proper guidance. Beyond that, I've always wanted to experience America, so working as an au pair was something I seriously considered. I'm originally from Germany, from a tiny village outside Cologne. Most Americans have never heard of it, so when people ask where I'm from, I usually just say Germany. It's easier that way. Before you say anything, I believe that my English is rather good, or so I'm told. It's gotten considerably better since living in the US, and people are often impressed by it. My father is originally from the UK and did everything in his power to ensure that my English was as good as my German, if not better. I'm not sure if they have them here in the US, but I had an electronic dictionary growing up that doubled as a translator. I remember messing around with it a ton as a kid, plugging in words and translating them with my dad. I also read like crazy when I was younger, which I think definitely helped me. Anyway, my host family lives in a wealthy suburb in Northern California. Their house is unbelievable. You might think living here would be lonely, but the agency does a great job of connecting nearby au pairs, so I immediately clicked with a few girls in the surrounding neighborhoods. My best friend here is an American girl named Jennifer. She's great. She's like me, but a little louder and a little taller. We've been inseparable since we met. We're both here for the same reasons, working, exploring, and trying to make the most of our time abroad. There's a huge college campus nearby, and it's pretty much the only decent place to go out that isn't a $100 Uber away. Both the frat and bar scenes there are pretty good, so that's where we spend most of our weekends. I think a lot of the guys are naturally drawn to us because of our accents, and the international card gets us pretty far. It's supposedly difficult to get into frat parties without being in a sorority here, but we don't have much of an issue. The bars here are a lot more fun though. Our favorite spot is this bar called Tap. I've noticed Americans love giving their nights themes. Taco Tuesday, Wine Wednesday. I guess any excuse to drink on a weekday, you know? It's kind of funny. Tuesdays are the most enjoyable nights of the week for Jenny and I. This story takes place on one of those nights. About a few months after I arrived to the US, I was standing by the bar, waiting on drinks for Jenny and I, when this tall guy with curly brown hair approached me and said, "You're German, right?" That kind of threw me off. People almost never guess I'm German. European, sure, but not German specifically. I don't really have distinctive German features, so anytime anyone's able to guess my nationality, it fascinates me. I laughed and told him he was right, and he introduced himself as Sebi with a confident smile. We talked for a while, and everything was very natural. I'll admit, I get approached a lot when I go out. I'm in shape, and I know I'm decent looking, but guys are usually kind of obvious and cheesy when they talk to me. Sebi felt different. The more we talked, the more it seemed like he was actually interested in me as a person as opposed to just hitting on me. He knew a lot of tidbits about German culture, which was something I quite liked about him. A lot of the Americans I don't talk to don't know much about the rest of the world, so it was nice to talk to someone well-traveled, smart, and cultured. We talked and laughed for a while longer before I introduced him to Jenny. He smiled and waved his friend over, an Asian guy who introduced himself as Hunter. He and Jenny immediately hit it off. All in all, it was a great time. Before the night ended, Sebi asked me for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. A few days later, Sebi invited me over for dinner. When I got to his place, I expected him to have dinner reservations ready or something, but instead he was cooking a pasta dish for us in the kitchen. It was quite sweet. I ended up helping him prepare the meal, and he opened a bottle of wine for us. I had such a great time that I ended up sleeping over at his apartment. The next morning, I woke up and examined his room a little. Unlike most college apartments, it was quite clean. He didn't have any posters or typical decorations up, but rather a bunch of landscape pictures. His walls were covered with dozens of square photographs, all black and white. Castles, cities, countryside views, they all looked oddly familiar. I got up and looked at them a little more closely, realizing they all had locations printed on them. They were all from Germany, every single one with the exception of a picture of Monte Carlo, Monaco. Sebi had woken up by then, so I turned and asked him jokingly if he had a thing for German architecture. He laughed and told me about his dad's aerial photo collection, which he had picked some of his favorites from. I walked back towards his bed and realized there were some more pictures above his bed. My jaw literally dropped when I saw that one of the pictures was a landscape of my village, taken from above. The picture was like 20 minutes from my house. I told him this, and he got rather excited, telling me what a crazy coincidence that was. I was amazed. The odds of that were so slim. He then asked me a bunch of questions about my hometown, which I was happy to answer. Over the next few weeks, Sebi and I spent a lot of time together. I was working and he had class during the week, but we spent every weekend going out together, plus Tuesdays. Everything was great. He was a sweet guy and made sure I was comfortable and enjoying myself when we went out. He was also quite nice to my friends, which I appreciated. His friend Hunter turned out to be a little weird though. Every time someone would play Take It Off by Fisher, he would quite literally start stripping in front of Jenny. One night, Sebi got rather drunk, significantly drunker than usual. As he was walking me to his apartment, he was going on and on about how much he loved German women and how he always wanted a German wife. At one point, he said he always wanted to marry an au pair because foreign girls are great with kids. I brushed it off as some weird fantasy, but that was the first thing he did or said that didn't sit well with me. Obviously not a deal breaker though, he had been perfect up until then. But then came the first time he took me out to dinner. He took me to this Italian spot and told me he'd picked it because they had plenty of vegetarian options, which was sweet, but I never told him I was vegetarian. I gave him a little smile and playfully asked him how he knew I was vegetarian, and he told me he saw it in one of my Insta posts. That eased me for the rest of the dinner. But later, when I was back home, I realized my only post mentioning it was from years ago, and I post a lot, so you'd have to scroll pretty far to get there, let alone pick up on the caption I had used. And that's not even mentioning the fact that all my posts are from a long time ago in Germany. The next time I stayed over, while Sebi was asleep, I unlocked his phone. I remembered his password, he hadn't exactly been careful about hiding it. What I found in there was sickening. There was a folder in his camera roll titled Wife, which contained screenshots of my social media dating back months. Posts, captions, tagged locations, even screenshots of old stories I didn't even remember posting. His notes app was even worse. There were English translations of my old posts in there, plus a rough schedule of when and where I'd go out based on my Instagram story posts. There was information in there about my hometown, about Germany, about things I liked. All based on my Instagram, if you could believe it. But the worst thing I found in his phone was a photo of my driver's license. Everything hit me at once. The second night I had gone out in America, I had lost my wallet at a frat party which had my ID in it. That's how he found my Instagram. That's how he knew everything. Where I was from, what I liked, my birthday. None of it was chance. He had planned all of it. There was a long graphic message that went into disgusting detail about what he wanted to do to me, which I don't want to talk about. I didn't know who the guy in those messages was. I couldn't stand to look at everything anymore, so I grabbed my stuff and slipped out of his apartment without making a sound. Regrettably, I didn't take any photos for evidence. The whole drive back to my host family's house, my hands were shaking. Germans take privacy seriously. I felt sick. My au pair profile was private, but my ID? He had my full name, and with that, I knew he could have found anything. I didn't sleep that night. I prayed that he hadn't been able to figure out my host family's address. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. They were all from Sebi, asking me where I went, why I left, if I went through his phone. I sent him one final message, telling him that if he ever tried to contact me again, I'd call the police. Then I blocked him on everything. For the next few days, I lived in perpetual fear, worrying that he'd show up at any moment. I privated my Instagram, locked everything down, and created a close friends story for when I went out, just in case he tried to find me again. Thankfully, he hasn't shown up yet, and it's been about 3 months since I last heard from him. Still though, I can't help but feeling this pit in my stomach that he knows my host family's address, and that he's planning something. I hope I never see him again, but I'll update if something else happens. Update. I hoped I wouldn't have to do this, but the past few weeks, I noticed the same silver car driving up and down my host family's street, sometimes just sitting across the street from their house. He's also tried to reach out to me through fake phone numbers and Instagram accounts, all within the same time frame. The messages always just ask me to talk, but I haven't responded to any of them. All of this gives me reason to believe he knows where I'm living, and that I'm potentially in danger. I'm building a case to present to the police, but I've heard that they don't take this kind of thing very seriously. Luckily, my au pair commitment ends soon, so I'll be back in Germany soon enough. This happened a few years ago. I've always wanted to live in Europe, ever since I was a kid. It was my lifelong dream. More than anything though, I wanted to work with kids. I've always had a way with them, and I knew ever since I was little that I wouldn't be fully content with my life if my job didn't involve caring for or teaching kids in some capacity. So when I found out I could become an au pair in France, where I could use my French from high school and be part of a family, it felt like everything was falling into place. The decision wasn't easy. I'm from Canada, and the move was a big one, but France had favorable visa options for Canadians, and it was the perfect chance to improve my French, Canada's second language. Plus, I had a few friends in Paris, so I wouldn't be entirely alone there. Money, though, was a problem. I didn't have family support. I won't get into why, that's personal, but let's just say I was on my own. I couldn't afford one of those expensive agencies, so I used a free au pair website instead. Not ideal, but it was all I could manage. That's how I connected with Leah. Leah's ad was warm and straightforward. She needed help with her 2 kids while her husband traveled for work. She seemed wonderful, very polite and very friendly. On our video calls, she was quick to call me chérie and ma belle, which felt different from home, but in a charming, motherly way. She asked a lot about me, how I was with kids, how I felt about family life, but didn't talk much about herself. Still, she felt genuine. I trusted her. The only thing that felt off was the kids. I asked to meet them on our calls more than once. Leah always had a reason why they couldn't join. One was napping, the other was at school, or they were on a playdate with a friend. She promised I'd meet them the second I arrived. It felt a little strange, but I figured I'd see them soon enough. Leah sent me a formal agreement. Everything looked proper, and we agreed on my start date. I booked my flight, packed my life into a suitcase, and said goodbye to Canada. When I landed at Charles de Gaulle, Leah wasn't there. That surprised me. From everything I had heard, most host families meet their au pairs at the airport. But then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Leah, telling me that she was stuck in traffic and instructing me to go to the side drop-off area where she'd have me picked up. I remember using Google Translate on her message because it sounded like she was going to have someone else pick me up, and I wanted to double-check. I was right, and that made me confused and a little unsettled. Despite that, I followed her instructions. A few minutes later, a car drove up and a woman approached, late 40s maybe, with short blonde hair and a bright smile. She looked nothing like Leah. She introduced herself as Leah's cousin and said, "You must be Leah's au pair. She sent me to get you." I hesitated. Something felt off immediately. I asked her if I could talk to Leah and unlocked my phone. She told me that Leah was probably still driving and assured me that she'd be waiting for me at home. I called Leah anyway, and it went straight to voicemail. It didn't even ring. The woman kept telling me that I'd be fine with a huge smile on her face. I was confused, but also exhausted from the flight. And what was I supposed to do? Stand there in the airport forever? So I did what she said and got in the car. The woman kept the conversation going non-stop as we drove. She asked about my flight, my life in Canada, and if I was excited to start my new job. But when I tried to steer the conversation back to Leah or the children, she brushed it off, just said that I'd love them and that I'd see them soon. I started to feel worse and worse about the whole situation. She was too polished, too eager to keep me talking without actually answering anything. The scenery outside began to change. I had the address in Google Maps, and the route we were taking didn't match. We were heading away from the suburbs and into what looked like an industrial-type area. I started panicking. I felt like I was in the process of being abducted. I asked her directly where we were going, and she responded lightly, calling it a shortcut, again repeating that Leah was expecting us. I felt the blood drain from my face. I knew at that point that she was lying. I told her to take me back to the airport, but she didn't answer. I told her I'd call the police if she didn't take me back to the airport, and she told me to relax. But I wasn't letting up. No matter what I said, she just kept repeating herself about Leah and insisted that I was overreacting. The next time the car slowed down, I kicked the door open and jumped out onto the street. The woman didn't drive off. Instead, she kind of just looked at me like I was the one who was acting crazy. I called my mom, who told me to get away from the car, get somewhere safe, and call for help. As I was talking to my mom, I looked through the windshield and noticed the woman now on her phone, speaking rapidly in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't French, and it definitely wasn't English. I couldn't shake the gut feeling that she was talking to Leah. There wasn't another car in sight, but under no circumstance was I getting back in that vehicle. Eventually, the driver's side door opened, and the woman took a step towards me. I screamed that I was on the phone with the police, and that actually got her to stop. Without saying another word, she went back to the car, threw my suitcase onto the road, and then sped off. I got the license plate as she drove away, but I was on the verge of tears with my mom still on the phone. I ended up hitchhiking to one of my friend's houses. I honestly don't know what I would have done without that option. My friend's family helped me report everything to the police, and eventually even agreed to help me with the fare back to Canada, which I was beyond grateful for. Eventually, they updated me on what the police informed them. Apparently, there was no registered au pair family by Leah's name. The number Leah used was prepaid and untraceable. All the photos of the children were taken from the internet. Everyone I talked to about this tells me the same thing. I was moments away from being trafficked. The worst part about that whole thing was that I wasted all that money on those plane tickets and traumatized myself permanently. Looking back, I know how lucky I am. I was moments away from something terrible, something I can barely let myself imagine. The whole situation was calculated from start to finish, and if I hadn't trusted my gut, I might not be here to tell the story. It took some time, but I eventually made my way back to France, this time through a verified agency. I'm hoping to eventually fulfill residency requirements and become a permanent citizen here. My son George has always had the strangest friends. I'm not sure why, but in his earlier years, he always attracted what would be considered the weird kids. I've got a ton of stories about this, but there's one that kind of sticks out like a thorn. He was in the 4th grade, and we had just moved due to my husband's reassignment, so George was new to his school. He had always been an outgoing and friendly kid, so my husband and I weren't particularly worried about his ability to make new friends. We were transitioning well as a family, and everything was going well with him at school. I was beyond pleased the first time I met all of George's classmates' parents, as they all seemed like upstanding, honest people. A few months after the move, I got a call from George's school in the middle of the day requesting one of his parents come in to discuss an incident involving him and another student. My husband was at work, so I assumed the responsibility and agreed to meet with the principal after picking up my son. I remember feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. Anger, obviously. I mean, my son had probably been in a fight, which I'd need to punish him for should I find out he was the antagonizer. But confusion as well. Physical altercations were very uncharacteristic of George, which made this more concerning to me. As I was walking him to the principal's office, he refused to answer any of my questions about the situation, which was also very unlike him. Usually, he was extremely talkative and what you'd call an oversharer, so his silence was somewhat unsettling. I figured he was either embarrassed or scared, so I didn't think much of it. The principal asked that George sit in the waiting room outside his office, so that's where I left him. After closing the door, the principal directed me to a chair in front of his desk, which is where I sat down. He began asking me questions about George, the kinds of questions you'd expect. How is his behavior at home? Does he listen? Does he talk back? Is he respectful? You know, things like that. I had nothing but positive things to say. George was an extremely well-behaved and respectful boy, and that's not the mother in me. I was just telling the objective truth. Eventually, the principal told me why I had been called in. Apparently, George had gotten into a brief altercation with a classmate after recess, a boy named Sebastian. I asked about the circumstances of the fight, and this is what I was told. They had been the last 2 students outside, and they were walking up the stairs together. Seemingly out of nowhere, George pulled an eraser out of his pocket and struck Sebastian over the head with it, causing him to fall to the ground and start screaming. I was baffled. It was totally unlike George to do something like that without being provoked. Plus, I had heard about the Sebastian boy before. George spoke fondly of him, like they were close friends. I asked the principal more questions, but he didn't seem to have the answers, and ultimately admitted that no one had seen the incident, but both boys had independently confirmed details of the story. He then said that George wasn't in trouble, as a little fight wasn't too uncommon. He told me that he just wanted to inform me, and that no further action would be taken, which definitely calmed me down. After that, he excused me, so I left. George was still silent about the whole thing as I drove him home, and only opened up to me right before bedtime. Admittedly, I had grown frustrated with him for not talking to me, which was probably why he quit the silent act. He told me that Sebastian had tricked him. I asked him to elaborate, and he told me that they had been playing make-believe Street Fighter. As per Sebastian's instruction, George had pulled out an eraser for a KO move of some sort. Out of nowhere, Sebastian fell to the ground and pretended to be really hurt. He then whispered in George's ear that he'd seriously hurt him if George didn't pretend like he'd attacked him. So that's what George did, and all the teachers assumed it had been a real fight. Rightfully so, I was pretty pissed. My little boy had been taken advantage of and falsely accused. Instead of going to the school, I decided to handle things myself. That night, I went through the school's directory and found Sebastian's mother's phone number. She introduced herself as Maggie, and I was kind of taken aback by how sweet and genuine she sounded on the phone. She told me she had heard about the incident, gotten the real story from Sebastian, and already reprimanded him. I thought it was kind of odd that Sebastian would have told the truth to his mother so soon, but I was happy I didn't have to do any convincing. She then went on to say that Sebastian had always had some minor behavioral problems growing up, and he'd sometimes think and act like another person entirely. I actually started to feel bad the more she told me. It seemed as if he wasn't fully in control of some of his actions. Maggie suggested that the boys schedule a sleepover to make up for the whole thing and become better friends, which I thought was a great idea. She offered to host, and I was appreciative of that. That weekend, I drove over to her house with George, who had returned to his bubbly, talkative self. Maggie invited me in, and the two of us got to know each other over some wine while the boys played in the basement. Like I said before, Maggie seems like a completely upstanding person, and I really enjoyed her company. I ended up staying for a few hours, and the time flew by. Eventually, I just had to ask about Sebastian's behavior, as it had been bugging me for a while. Her entire demeanor changed, and she lowered her voice a bit. She told me that he often had trouble making friends, and that he's seen a few doctors, all of whom think it's something he'll outgrow soon. She went on to say that he's gotten much better at controlling himself, and the fact that he was being more social at school was a good sign. I didn't inquire much more than that. I just wanted to make sure my son would be safe for the night. Maggie promised me George would be in good hands, and that Sebastian didn't have a history of getting physical or violent, more so just acting strange. That was enough reassurance for me. This woman was clearly genuine, and it actually felt kind of nice knowing that George would be helping Sebastian learn how to make friends. Eventually, it came time to leave, so I went downstairs to say goodbye to George. The two boys were laughing and playing Battleship. It looked like they were really getting along. I kissed my son goodbye and drove home. The next morning, I went to go pick him up. When I got to the house, he was waiting near the door with all his stuff and a smile on his face. I assumed the night went well. I said good morning to Maggie and packed George's stuff in the car. As we were driving away though, he started bawling out of nowhere. I asked him what was wrong in a concerned voice, and what he told me was quite literally jaw-dropping. George said that everything was going well until it came time to go to sleep. The boys had set up their sleeping arrangements in the basement, 2 air mattresses side by side. Everything seemed normal when they went to bed, but at some point in the night, George woke up. He wasn't sure why at first. Then he heard something. Whispering. It was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly open, and there was a strange flickering light inside, not like a regular bathroom light. As George described it, it seemed more like a candle light. He listened closer and realized it was Sebastian talking. But he wasn't just talking, he was having a full conversation. George thought maybe he was on the phone or something, but the more he listened, the weirder it got. Sebastian wasn't calling himself Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim. George felt frozen. It was like Sebastian thought he was someone else, and he wasn't talking to anyone, just the mirror. Then the candle went out. Everything was dark again. George squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. A long time passed, and then he heard the bathroom door creak open. His stomach dropped when he heard whispering again, this time right above him. It went on for a while. George didn't understand the words. It didn't even sound like English. He just lay there, too scared to move. Eventually, Sebastian went back to bed like nothing happened. In the morning, he was totally normal again. George didn't dare ask him about it. When George told me what happened, I was horrified. My gut told me this wasn't just a case of childhood imagination. Something was wrong. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to tell someone. I called Maggie first. At first, she laughed it off, saying Sebastian has always been a creative kid, but as I pressed her, her voice faltered. Eventually, she admitted that his so-called behavioral problems were more serious than she let on. One psychiatrist had even suggested he was showing signs of multiple personality disorder. They had already moved twice before, she told me in a hushed tone, because Sebastian had been kicked out of school. I was stunned, furious even. Why the hell hadn't she told me this before? Why would she put my son in danger like that? Then she did something unexpected. She begged me not to notify the school. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to respect her wishes, but another part of me knew that something was very wrong. I blurted out, "Okay," and hung up the phone before she could respond. I told myself I'd make my decision by the end of the week, but I never got the chance. That Monday, Sebastian full-on attacked another student at recess. It was serious enough that the school sent out a statement to all the parents, though they kept the details vague. By the end of the day, I found out that he had been expelled. I tried calling Maggie, but her phone had seemingly been disconnected. The situation was incredibly unsettling. Just days ago we had spoken, and now, suddenly, she was unreachable. I didn't even know what I wanted to say to her, just that I wanted to say something. There were no other numbers or emails in the school directory, just that one number that was now disconnected. A few days later, the curiosity got too overwhelming, so I bit the bullet and drove to her house. When I arrived, it was completely vacated. No moving trucks, no sign of a rushed departure, just gone. It didn't make sense. How could they have left so quickly? I tried looking them up, searching for any trace of them online. I found nothing. No forwarding address, no mention of them anywhere. It was like they had never existed at all. That was a long time ago, and George wasn't too badly affected by it. In all honesty, I think he's mostly forgotten about it. I haven't, though. I often think about what could have happened to my son that night in that basement, or what kind of things that kid Sebastian has been doing since. My upbringing was a little unorthodox. I grew up in a Southern Baptist household. The kind where we didn't believe in ghosts, but were absolutely certain about demons. Let me explain. If something strange happened, it wasn't a spirit or wandering soul. It was something darker, something biblical. I never fully bought into it, but the message was drilled into me from a young age. Rejecting demons meant rejecting scripture itself. My mother, though, was different. Faith was optional for her. She wasn't atheist or agnostic, just indifferent. She'd say things like, "God and I have an understanding," whenever I pressed her about church. While I leaned into religion as a source of structure and stability, she drifted further from it. It was one of the many things that widened the gap between us. I won't sugarcoat it. My mother struggled with addiction, mental health issues, things she never wanted help for. Some days she was functional, others she was downright insane. I tried not to take it personally, but it was hard. Looking back, she definitely had schizophrenia or some kind of adjacent condition. But before you say anything about my family being neglectful of her mental health, it was a different time back then. One afternoon, I had a nightmare so vivid that I still remember every detail to this day. In the dream, I was lying in bed when my mother stormed into my room, screaming in a fit of rage. She grabbed me by the wrist and started shaking me violently. I woke up in a pool of sweat, my body still rigid with fear. But before I could shake off the dream, it happened again. Except this time, I wasn't asleep. The door barged open, and there she was, just as she had been in my nightmare. Same expression, same unhinged anger, same words. It was like the dream had been some kind of prophecy. I barely managed to push her off and yell for her to stop, and then it was over. She left as suddenly as she had entered, and when I confronted her the next morning, she had no memory of it. She seemed confused, even a little hurt that I was so shaken. I told myself it was a coincidence, some bizarre overlap between my subconscious and her moods, but part of me wondered if it was something worse. A few weeks later, I heard her screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a panicked scream or even a distressed one. The scream sounded more excited. I don't even know if that makes sense, but that's the best way I can describe it. I rushed outside and froze at what I saw. My mother was standing in the yard, grinning, holding a massive 7-foot-long snake in her bare hands. That was terrifying enough on its own, but there's something you don't know which made it even worse. My mother had a lifelong phobia of snakes. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. But there she was, gripping one like it was a toy. She said, "Come here," and motioned for me to grab the snake. I took a step back, shaking my head. I literally said, "Mom, what the hell?" But the look in her eye told me she couldn't even understand the words I was saying. She just smiled wider and tilted her head like she was trying to scare me. I couldn't deal with it. I turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding. I peeked out the window and saw her still standing there, holding the snake like an offering. Eventually, she let it slither onto the ground and walked back inside as if nothing had happened. Later, when I asked her about it, she shrugged like I was making it up. She told me I must have had a strange dream and refused to entertain me when I continued to ask about it. That was nothing compared to what I'm about to tell you, though. That winter, my church held an overnight lock-in. I was relieved to go. Church was my escape, a place where I could be around predictable, normal people. My mother dropped me off completely sober and even kissed my forehead before driving away. At around 4:30 a.m., just as we were settling into sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. We all sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved, traveling around the building in an impossible way at times. It sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal. It was rhythmic, circling the chapel like someone or something was trying to break in. The pastor, the only one with a key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard a thing. I ran to wake him, and as soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front doors and literally stumbled back in fear. Standing there, barefoot and sweating in the freezing air, was my mother. Her clothes were disheveled, and her hair was dripping with sweat. Her lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked on me immediately. A slow, unsettling smile stretched across her face as she walked toward me. I wanted to run. The pastor tried to hold me back, whispering, "Stay here." But I felt completely powerless, like I had no choice but to go with her. I climbed into the car, afraid that she was going to do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She didn't answer when I asked why she was there. When we got home, she stopped in the doorway and just stared at me. She stood there silently watching me as I walked to my room. I closed the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours, listening. In the morning, she was in the kitchen cooking breakfast. She was cheerful and clearly oblivious to what had happened the night before. She jumped back when she saw me, saying she was just about to pick me up from the church. I felt the blood drain from my face. She had no memory of knocking on the church doors, no memory of driving me home. It was freaky. I expected someone, the pastor, a church elder, even one of the chaperones, to say something about what had happened, but no one did. It was like they didn't know what to make of it, or worse, they didn't want to. That's kind of the way people treated my mom back then. That was decades ago. She's gone now, but her memory is something that will never leave me, for better or for worse. I don't know if I believe in demons or the supernatural anymore, but I can't explain what happened. The logical explanation is that she was suffering from mental illness, maybe addiction withdrawal, or maybe something else entirely. But the memory lapses, the eerie timing, the way she acted like a different person some nights, it still haunts me. I tell myself there's a rational answer for all of it, but even now, I'm not sure I believe that. My eldest son started sleepwalking when he was about 8 or 9. I had heard of kids going through phases like that, so I wasn't too concerned at first. It was just one of those things. A little unsettling, sure, but nothing I thought much about. I'm a pretty light sleeper, so none of my kids have ever been able to sneak around the house at night without me knowing. That's actually how I first figured out about my son's habit. Most nights, I'd wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, rocking slightly on his heels, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes would be open, but they weren't seeing anything. That was the one part that always got me. For any of you who have lived with a sleepwalker, you know exactly what I'm talking about. His gaze would pass right through me, empty and distant, like he was looking past me into something I couldn't see. It was always extremely strange, and I never fully acclimated to finding him like that. Sometimes he'd mumble something under his breath, words too soft and slurred to understand. Other times, he wouldn't make a sound, just standing there, breathing in that slow, steady way that somehow made it even worse. I'd gently guide him to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. He never seemed to remember any of it in the morning. Things escalated a few months after I made the realization that he was a sleepwalker. One night, I woke up to a rhythmic tapping sound. It sounded like water droplets repeatedly dripping onto a window pane, only it wasn't raining outside. It was soft, barely loud enough to wake me. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, some far-off noise that my half-asleep brain had misinterpreted. But as I lay there, the sound continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't sporadic like rainfall would be. It occurred at regular intervals, and always at the same volume. I kept listening, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't the house settling, and it wasn't the wind outside. It was too precise. Once I realized the tapping wasn't going to stop, I begrudgingly accepted that I'd have to deal with it. I sat up and looked towards the door, which is where the sound was coming from. My husband was fast asleep, and I didn't want to disturb him. I should mention that I wasn't scared, just curious. Otherwise, I probably would have woken him up. Anyway, I got out of bed to investigate. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw him. My son facing the wall, his forehead lightly knocking against it in slow, measured taps. His fingertips gently grazed the wall in rhythm with his forehead taps, as if he was trying to walk through it. I remember calling his name, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react, just kept pressing his head forward, knocking it in that eerie rhythmic way, like he was testing something, like he was trying to push through. I stepped closer, but right before I was about to intervene, I hesitated. Something about the way he was moving genuinely sent a chill right through me. I gently reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, shaking him just enough to pull him out of whatever trance he was in. He blinked, took a step back, and then, as if nothing had happened, let me lead him back to bed. He never mentioned it in the morning. It happened a few more times, but it was pretty infrequent if I'm being honest. I figured it was just another strange habit of sleepwalkers. Maybe some kind of subconscious response to the wall being there. Some internal sense of space that his dreaming mind hadn't accounted for. And eventually, he outgrew it. The sleepwalking stopped, and the strange, vacant staring in the hallway became a weird little memory that I mostly forgot about. That is, until my younger son started doing the same thing years later. The sleepwalking, I mean. At first, I brushed it off. Kids go through phases. Some behaviors repeat themselves. It was just so uncanny that both of them started sleepwalking around the same age. Again though, nothing too unusual. Genetics are a fascinating thing. But eventually, I started noticing the little details. The things that gave me a growing sense of concern. It wasn't just that he sleepwalked. It was how he sleepwalked. He stood in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes open but unfocused. He moved the same way as my older son had, with that slow, eerie rhythm. Like his movements weren't completely random. It was unsettling. It felt like I was living the memory of watching my older son do the same thing years earlier. But it got worse than that. One night, I woke up to that tapping noise again. I already knew what I'd see before I stepped into the hallway, and I was right. There he was, forehead pressed to the exact same spot, knocking against the wall like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. It was the exact same behavior my older son had exhibited all those years ago, from the forehead taps all the way down to the way his fingers brushed against the wall. I called his name. Nothing. I touched his shoulder. Nothing. He just kept knocking, his small body swaying slightly, lost in some deep, unreachable place. And that's when it hit me. He had never seen his older brother sleepwalk. At least not that I know of. His brother hadn't done this in years. There was no reason for him to exhibit the same exact behavior. Not just the wandering, but the standing, the tapping, the eerie, misplaced urgency of it. I don't know why, but that thought made me feel sick. After some badgering, I eventually snapped him out of his trance. I guided him back to bed and tucked him in like I had done so many times before, trying to tell myself that it was just one of those things. And then, just like his brother, he outgrew it. Just like that, no more sleepwalking, no more tapping. He had no recollection of it either. For years, I didn't think about it. In all honesty, I had forgotten about the whole thing, but there's a reason I'm writing this now. My sons are away at college now, and the house is a lot quieter than what I'm used to. Because of that, my husband and I have to find new things to occupy some of that downtime with. A few weeks ago, we decided to renovate the house. The house is pretty old, and we've lived in it long enough that we've decided to change things up. New floors, new paint, some fresh updates to make the place feel new again. It was all minor work, nothing too intensive. We were stripping the old wallpaper when we noticed something underneath. At first, I thought it was just some old backing or maybe a weird stain, but as we peeled more away, my breath caught. It was an old, antique-style mirror, a mirror that had been covered for some reason. My first thought was, why the hell would someone cover a mirror instead of removing it? I felt ridiculous, standing there staring at a piece of glass like it was going to do something, but I couldn't help but feel like we weren't supposed to find it, like it had been sealed away for a reason. And that's when I realized the mirror was positioned in the exact spot on the wall that my sons had been bumping into all those years ago. The memories came flooding back, and I stood there in shock. There was no logical reason they should have known it was there. They couldn't have, and yet somehow they had. Both of them had independently been trying to walk into something that was impossible to see through the wallpaper. Forget about the fact that they were unconscious. I immediately got rid of that mirror, but I'm still pretty freaked out by the whole thing. There's got to be some kind of rational explanation for this, but I can't think of one. I still don't know what to make of this. I really don't. When I was 22, I started renting the downstairs apartment in my parents' house just to save money, but also have a little more privacy. Even though my parents would go away a decent amount, it still just felt like I had no privacy and couldn't even have friends or girls over in peace. The downstairs apartment is separated by a lockable door in the stairway. It was an open layout down there, with the mini kitchen being a part of the living room area. There was then my bedroom, bathroom, and laundry room down the hall, and a side entrance through the living room. This happened on a weekend that my parents were away, so I could be as loud as I wanted. I had my friends Anthony and Jay over just to shoot the shit and have a couple drinks on the couch watching the hockey game. Since my parents weren't home, we were blasting music as we chilled. I wouldn't say I got drunk, but I definitely got a buzz going by the end of the game. I would keep the door between my apartment and the upstairs unlocked when my parents were gone, since I didn't have to worry about them randomly coming down. I kept the drinks in the fridge upstairs since it was bigger and quite literally just worked better. Since my friends drove and had been drinking, both of them decided to crash at my place for the night. The couch down there was massive. It could easily sleep 3 people if they laid down the correct way. So after a pretty long night of drinking, I said goodnight and went to my room to go to sleep. I found myself waking up in my bed a few hours later. It was still the middle of the night, or early morning hours. I immediately heard what most likely woke me up. I heard footsteps from upstairs. Someone was walking around up there. It was a pretty natural assumption that it was Anthony or Jay going upstairs to check my parents' fridge for cold water or something, so I didn't let it bother me. I closed my eyes again, only to hear something else just a couple minutes later. The sound of my bedroom doorknob. Someone tried twisting it, but it was locked. I always lock my bedroom door, it's just a force of habit. I wondered why either of them were trying to come in, but I was tired and figured if I just didn't say anything and pretended to be asleep, they'd go back to sleep themselves. Maybe it sounds weird, but I just didn't have the energy to be bothered at all, and it worked. I fell asleep shortly after that. When I woke up the next morning, Anthony was already gone, but Jay was still asleep on the couch. When he heard me open the fridge door, he slowly started moving around and rubbing his eyes. I asked him if he was trying to come into my room last night, and he said no, he didn't think so, but that he didn't remember because he got pretty drunk. He and I went to a nearby deli to get some bacon, egg, and cheeses and coffee, and then we ate them in my backyard. He left not long after that, and I pretty much went about my day as usual. I didn't ask Anthony if he tried coming into my room because honestly I didn't care that much about it. It really wasn't a huge deal. I think I spent most of that Saturday out of the house doing stuff with other friends. I got back home pretty late at night, but not really intoxicated because that day was more of a marathon, and by then I'd sobered up. I was beat though, so I had a snack, washed up, and went straight to bed. When I say went to bed, I actually mean I crawled into bed and watched like an hour of something on TV. After I turned off the TV, right away, I heard it. Creaks and thumps from above, almost sounding like footsteps similar to the night before, directly overhead in the kitchen upstairs. I had to really focus and listen, but the sound stopped. I felt my heart start beating a bit faster. I felt a slight nervous feeling in my gut for a few minutes as I was sitting up and waiting to hear something else. Eventually, I laid back down and relaxed, realizing it was most likely just some normal house settling noises, and my paranoid thoughts were making them out to be louder than they were. I couldn't have been more wrong. I should have trusted my initial feeling. When I heard the doorknob to my bedroom door move again, I sprang up so quickly that you'd think I was about to get hit by a bus. The doorknob only moved for a couple seconds like it did the night before, but tonight, there was a light knock at the door followed by the doorknob. I didn't say a word. I reached for my phone, which was on the bed, and started texting my family along with Anthony and Jay. I knew the chances of it being one of my friends were next to zero, but deep down I was hoping one of them would by some chance respond back saying, "Yes, it's me." My parents didn't answer the phone, they must have been asleep. They were not supposed to be back until Monday. There was no way I was about to say, "Who's there?" I quietly got out of my bed and hid behind the corner dresser, grabbing a blunt object in the scary chance that whoever was out there would kick the door down and rush the bed. I'm not kidding, I think 10 minutes went by and I didn't move from the spot, but there wasn't another set of knocks. I called 911 finally and whispered as quietly as I could while still being loud enough to hear. I waited on the line with a 911 operator until the police arrived. Since I didn't feel safe exiting the room, I asked the operator if she could tell the police to meet me at my bedroom window. Once an officer was outside my window, they gave it a tap and I went to open it. Thank God I was on the first floor. I handed him the key to the side door, and moments later I heard the entrance to my apartment open. It was only then that I left my bedroom and was greeted by 2 officers. I turned on all the lights. My apartment was small with not many places to hide, so the search down there was quick. Then we went up to the main floor of the house and searched it. Nothing. And then we got upstairs. I told the officers what each room was before they'd enter. It was when they entered my parents' room that I heard a commotion about 30 seconds later. I was outside in the hallway when I heard it. I took one peek into the room and saw 2 officers yelling at someone under my parents' bed. I felt a knot in my stomach. I was told to wait downstairs. It was minutes later that they were walking down a tall, dirty, scary-looking man in a sweatshirt and shorts. They asked me if I knew this man, and I said of course not. The look of hate that man gave me was haunting. He looked like he could have been homeless, crazy, or both. Once he was out of the house, I felt a million times better. The police told me that if I or my parents wanted to follow up with this, to call the precinct. After they left, the first thing I did was text every family and friends group chat I had. Being that it was so late, only a few people responded. I called my parents first thing in the morning to explain what happened. They were of course in awe, as anyone would be, but because the man was homeless and nothing was apparently stolen, my parents didn't pursue any legal action. I feel like it's possible I left the front door unlocked that night Jay and Anthony came over, and he simply walked right in when we were blasting music. Or, a scarier thought, he could have been in the house for much longer than that, and we just never knew. I've always loved the quiet. I moved up to this little cabin in rural upstate New York about 5 years ago, away from the chaos of the city. The place is big, secluded, and the woods stretch out far beyond my property. The nearest neighbor is miles away, and the only sounds you can hear are the wind in the trees and the occasional bird chirping in the distance. It's peaceful, and that's how I like it. Fishing is my thing. I spend most of my time on the lake that sits just behind my house. It's the perfect place to escape everything. I don't mind being alone. Hell, I enjoy it. The cabin has a huge deck that looks out over the woods. I often sit out there with a cold beer in my hand, watching the sun dip behind the trees and listen to the nighttime sounds of the woods. It's always been peaceful, until recently. It started about 2 weeks ago. I was on the deck, like usual, just staring into the dark, when I heard something. A snap of a twig in the distance. I didn't think much of it. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon. The woods are full of life, and I've gotten used to the noises over the years. But as the days went by, the sounds became more frequent. At first, it was just that, twigs snapping or leaves rustling, things I thought were just animals. But then, one night, I heard something different. A scratching sound. It came from the side of the house, somewhere near the window of the spare bedroom. It was quiet, almost like it was trying to be sneaky. I stood up my chair, heart pounding a little faster than usual. I waited, but nothing came after that. Probably just a squirrel, I told myself. But I didn't feel right. I decided to go inside and lock up for the night. The next evening, I heard it again. The scratching. It wasn't just at the side of the house anymore. Now it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from right outside the spare bedroom window. I froze, listening carefully, my nerves starting to fray. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. I went to the window, pulling the curtains back slightly to see what was outside. The moonlight illuminated the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. The wind was still, and everything seemed normal. No animal, no person. I shook my head, telling myself that I was just letting my imagination run wild. It was probably a branch brushing up against the window, or maybe the wind. I convinced myself it wasn't anything to worry about and went to bed. The next night, the scratching returned. It wasn't just scratching anymore, though. It sounded like light tapping, as if someone were tapping on the window, trying to get my attention. My heart skipped a beat, and I jumped out of bed. I grabbed a flashlight and crept through the dark hallway toward the spare bedroom. When I reached the window, I shone the flashlight outside. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, just the same empty woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. The air around me felt thick, heavy. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every little noise seemed louder, and every creak of the floorboard sounded like someone was moving around in the house. I stayed awake, listening, but eventually I fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. The nights went on, and the sounds didn't stop. I'd hear them every night, always the same. A tap, a scratch, sometimes even a faint whisper that seemed to come from within the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it was getting harder. One night, I decided to confront whatever was causing it. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. Maybe a raccoon or some other critter had found its way inside. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed out back, figuring it might be a good idea to have something in case things got weird. I went to the spare bedroom and carefully opened the door. The air inside felt stale, like it hadn't been touched in ages. I hadn't used the room in months. I shone the flashlight around the room, moving slowly, checking every corner, under the bed, behind the dresser. Nothing. I stood there for a minute, feeling like an idiot. There was nothing. It was just the same old room, empty. but as I turned to leave, I noticed something. The closet door was slightly ajar. I don't remember leaving it that way. My stomach dropped. I slowly walked over and pulled open the door. Nothing was inside, but as I shone the flashlight into the back corner of the closet, I saw something strange. A small piece of cloth caught on the edge of the wall. It was dark, torn, almost like a piece of clothing. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't think straight. My mind raced. Was someone here? Had someone been inside my room? I backed out of the room, my heart thudding in my chest. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. I couldn't stay in that house another second. I went outside, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. The darkness of the woods felt like it was closing in on me, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my nerves. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. I slept on the couch that night, a baseball bat within reach, but I didn't hear anything. No scratching, no tapping. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The next night, I decided to be brave. I was going to stay in my bed, and I wasn't going to let whatever this was drive me out of my own house. But just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it again. The tap, tap, tap against the window. I jumped up, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight. I ran to the spare bedroom, not caring how loud my footsteps were. This time, when I pulled back the curtain, I didn't just see the woods. I saw a shadow. Someone standing just outside the window, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my blood running cold. I turned around, my mind spinning. Who was that? What were they doing here? I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it now. Someone had been outside my house, and they had been watching me. I ran to the phone and called 911, my hand shaking so much that I could barely dial. The operator answered, and I could barely speak through the panic in my voice. "Someone's been outside my house," I said, "and I think they're still here." I gave them my address, and they said they'd send someone out right away. I hung up and looked around the room. I needed to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. But as I turned to grab my jacket, I heard something from the hallway, a slow creak. Someone was moving through the house. I didn't hesitate. I ran for the back door, flinging it open and tearing through the woods. I ran as fast as I could, not stopping to look back, my lungs burning with every step. By the time I made it to the edge of the property, I could see the flashing lights of the police cars in the distance. I slowed down, my body trembling, and I hid behind a tree, watching. The officers arrived at the house, guns drawn, searching the place, but I didn't stick around to find out what happened. I couldn't. I knew that whatever or whoever had been in that house, it wasn't done. I wasn't safe there anymore. I haven't gone back since. I followed up with the police to let them know I was all right so there wouldn't be a search out for me. The cabin is still there, sitting alone in the woods, but it doesn't feel like home anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the tapping sound. I don't know who was in my house or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. They were waiting for me, and they're still out there. This happened when I was about 15 years old, back in 2008. My parents went out to the casino for the night, so it was just me and my dog Abby home alone. It was about 11 at night, and I was up messaging some friends on Instant Messenger and watching YouTube videos. As I was typing and chatting away, I heard Abby barking at something in the living room. I figured it might be my parents getting home and just waited. After about a minute or so of more barking and no sound of the door opening, I got up and went into the living room to check it out. Abby was facing the windows that looked out onto our driveway, still barking. I couldn't really see out of the windows because the lights were off outside, and it was really dark. I peered through the window and saw only the one car in our driveway, so I knew my parents hadn't come home yet. I chalked it up to Abby possibly hearing a neighbor's car door slam shut, or a particularly loud car driving by, as we lived on a main road with lots of noise, even late at night. I went back to messaging my friends, but over the next 5 minutes, I kept feeling like I was hearing noises around my house. Abby would stop and start barking again at different intervals. I was about to get up to calm her down, when I could have sworn I heard a knock or a rustling sound at the living room door. I got up and slowly made my way back into the living room to look through the windows again. Nothing. I was starting to get a little nervous and was too scared to look into the peephole in case some crazy face was staring back at me. I double-checked to make sure the door was locked and was about to leave the room when the sound of knocking suddenly came from the side door of the house. My heart fluttered. I didn't know what to think. Like, did my parents get locked out and they were trying to get in? Was someone trying to break in? Was there more than one person? I barely had time to register those thoughts when I heard the sound of the doorknob from downstairs being shimmied with, like someone was trying to open it. Our basement was essentially under the house, with the entrance being pretty hidden. To get to that door, you had to walk around the entire house into our backyard and go under the deck. You'd either need to already know the door was there, or be really determined to find a way in. Abby was whimpering and barking louder than ever, running from room to room trying to locate the threat. It felt like the whole house was surrounded. The noises from the basement grew louder, and it almost sounded like whoever it was had managed to get it open, because suddenly, the noise stopped. My heart sank. I stopped breathing, standing frozen in the silence, just waiting for the next sound. Then, quick as a whip, Abby flew down the stairs and started growling maniacally at whatever was down there. Abby was a good-natured black lab who had never hurt a fly, but in this moment, I had never heard her sound more threatening. It felt like I was frozen in place for minutes. Finally, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in when I realized Abby had stopped barking and growling. I called her upstairs and locked the door inside the house that led to the basement. I grabbed the home phone because I didn't have a cell phone yet and ran with Abby into the closet in my parents' room, where one of the guns we owned was stored. I sat there, armed and ready, about to call 911, when I suddenly heard the front door open. Abby sprinted out. I yelled no after her, but then heard the sound of my parents' voices. I ran into the living room to see them petting Abby and looking at me strangely. I spent the next several minutes recounting the events of the night to my parents. My mom was horrified, and my dad spent the next hour searching every corner of the house inside and out with his gun in hand. We didn't find anything, and I didn't sleep that night. The next afternoon, there was a knock at the front door. My heart immediately skipped a beat, and I instinctively darted into another room. My dad opened the door to find my Uncle Pete standing there with an envelope in his hand. Uncle Pete was a narcissistic creep, to say the least. He always mistreated my aunt and acted very weird around the kids and cousins at family parties. Nothing illegal as far as we knew, but he just had this way about him. You knew to try to avoid him. Growing up, I always felt a bit anxious whenever he talked to me. I can't remember anything specific he may have said, but his overall demeanor was unsettling. Even adults who spent too much time around him said he made them uncomfortable. I played softball, and his daughter, my cousin Kate, played in a league a few years below mine. I loved my cousin and always felt bad for her, having such a creepy dad, so I would often give her tips or help out her team with pitching and fielding lessons. My mom and I eavesdropped from another room and overheard Uncle Pete say something like, "I tried to stop by last night to drop it off, but no one was home, I guess." I couldn't hear much else, but shortly after, I heard my dad slam the door shut. My mom and I peeked out and asked what happened. My dad, his face quivering with anger, said that apparently Uncle Pete had been the one stomping around the house last night trying to get inside. He handed me the envelope, and I opened it to find a card with a gift card inside, thanking me for helping his daughter with softball lessons. A night of panic and terror, all at the hands of my creepy uncle. My dad had threatened him during the conversation at our front door, and after that, we never really spent time with him again. When I think about this story now, I'm at least glad I found out who was behind the incident. Otherwise, I might have spent years wondering if it had been burglars, a ghost, or something else. I'm thankful Abby was there to protect me. She most certainly scared him off when he was trying to get in through the basement. But even so, I'm still left with so many questions. What the hell was he thinking? Why did he need to drop that card off so late at night? Why didn't he get the hint that we weren't home when no one answered the front door? Why wouldn't he try calling the house to see if we were home? And worst of all, what would have happened had he gotten inside? My name is Garrett, and this took place when I was a sophomore in college. When I didn't get a dorm after freshman year, I scrambled for off-campus housing. Long story short, I ended up in a co-op, part of a 3-house community that was sort of near campus, but not really. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap and I didn't have many options. Plus, I had a bike, so I didn't really mind the extra travel time. Most of the residents were young students like me, but there were a few exceptions. There were a handful of alumni, 1 or 2 TAs, and a few older people getting their degrees later on in life. But the person who immediately stood out to me was an older woman who lived in one of the other houses. From what I could tell, she was maybe in her late 50s, even though she looked a little older than that. She had graying hair and walked with a sort of limp, like she had some kind of back injury. She was really quiet and mostly kept to herself, and she always had this blank expression on her face. I assumed she had some kind of connection to the university, maybe faculty, or maybe an alumni, but no one explained and I didn't ask. The first time I saw her do something strange was in our common kitchen, which was a little weird to begin with because the 2 other houses had their own kitchen, so I wasn't sure why she'd be hanging out in ours. She wasn't cooking or eating or even talking to anyone. She was just standing there while the rest of us were talking and running around, making dinner and listening to music. She didn't try and join in, she just watched us blankly. I caught eyes with her a few times, and part of me got the feeling that she was watching me specifically, even though I knew that was unlikely. No one acknowledged her, which I thought was a little weird too. Maybe they knew something I didn't. Later that week, I was doing some homework in my room when I saw her again. I glanced out my bedroom window, and there she was, staring up at me. As if that wasn't strange enough by itself, she wasn't even on the sidewalk, but rather in the middle of the street. It was getting late, and it was decently cold too, so she must have been freezing out there. I couldn't tell if she was looking into my window or just in the general direction of the house, but I felt like she was staring at me specifically. I don't know why I did it, but I waved at her, trying to be friendly. The moment I did, I instantly regretted it. She didn't wave back. Instead, she jumped up and down a few times like she was excited and then ran towards one of the other houses, presumably hers. I felt kind of sick. Not only had I acknowledged her, but I had confirmed that she had been looking into my room the entire time, and even if she hadn't, she now knew which room was mine. Later that night, I asked one of my housemates about her. He told me that that woman had always been there and that I should try my best to ignore her like the rest of them did. I inquired further about her, but the guy genuinely didn't know anything and said he was just repeating what someone had told him when he moved in. It didn't sit right with me, so I asked around until I got some semblance of an answer. One of the seniors in the specific house she lived in told me that she was associated with the university and was a little kooky, but that she didn't have a history of violence or getting physical. I asked him why no one found that as strange as I did, and he told me that they really couldn't control who lived there, as that decision was up to the property manager. I wasn't fully satisfied with that answer, but there was nothing I could do, so I tried to just block her out of my mind. But then it got worse. One night, I walked out of my room and nearly ran into her. She was in the hallway, standing right in front of my door. I literally jumped back because she caught me so off guard. It was past midnight on like a Tuesday, so the house was mostly dead. She didn't say anything when she saw me. She barely even reacted. Instead, she just turned and walked away as if I were the one who had intruded on her. I'm not going to go into every little detail, but there were several more occurrences like that one where I caught her either snooping somewhere where she had no business being or doing something she had no business doing. At some point, I lost my room key. All 3 houses had once been part of the same hotel, so all the rooms had personal locks and keys. It was a co-op, so most people just left their doors unlocked, but I was someone who couldn't sleep comfortably knowing someone could just walk into my room, so losing my key was a big deal. Everyone had a spare, including me, but I was pissed because I'd have to go make a copy of the key, and that was an extra annoyance I couldn't afford at the time. A few nights later, I woke up randomly in the night. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I heard it. There was a soft bumping coming from my closet every 20 seconds or so. It sounded like something shifting behind the door, like something was moving inside of my closet. I'm not one to scare easily, and I'm definitely not one to be helpless in a dangerous situation, so I was going to deal with this myself. I quietly got out of bed and took a deep breath. I slowly walked over to the closet, trying to keep my breathing under control. My heart was racing. In one fluid motion, I ripped the closet door open and screamed like a crazy person. Just as I expected, the woman was in there. She had one of my ties wrapped around her neck, and her eyes were wide open. She was holding a kitchen knife with her other hand. My scream must have startled her, because before I could react, she lunged at me with the knife outstretched. I screamed again, only this one wasn't pretend. It was a scream of pure fear. I wrestled her to the ground and was able to disarm her pretty easily, given how frail and small she was. That didn't make the situation any less terrifying, though. She kicked and fought and bit as I pinned her to the ground, screaming the whole time. I yelled for help, and I heard some doors slam, followed by some of my housemates running down the hall. My friend Lee immediately helped me immobilize the woman, and the two of us kept her pinned while someone else called the police. The rest of the night was a blur. The police got there quickly and arrested her on the spot. By that point, she had stopped screaming, but she refused to say anything either, which was extremely unsettling. The cops found my room key on her. Real big shocker there. A few weeks later, we got our answer about who she was. Apparently, she was the property manager's sister, who he had been letting live there under the radar. She had severe mental health issues, and instead of getting her proper care, he had just thrown her into one of the unoccupied rooms. I believe the property manager was eventually arrested for negligence and a slew of other things, and rightfully so. I honestly blame him so much more for what happened than her. If anything, I feel bad for her, but my pity won't erase the fact that she tried to kill me. I could have lost my life that night. I have no idea why she seemed so interested in me specifically, but I can only hope nothing like that ever happens to me again. I'm graduating soon, and I'm definitely going to miss college, but I don't think I'll ever be able to look back on my time here without thinking about that night. This isn't really my story, but I essentially watched the whole thing happen, so I'm telling it anyway. I've lived in a modest 2-story home with my husband Benjamin for the better part of 20 years now. All of our kids are out living their own lives, and I couldn't be prouder. What I'm about to tell you happened last year. Someone had just moved into the house across the street, which was really nice because I was getting sick of looking out at a vacant house all the time. I'm retired, so I spend a lot of time on my front porch, knitting, reading, enjoying the weather with my husband, you name it. I also listen to a lot of true crime podcasts out there, and sometimes I'll just play music. The person who moved into the house across the street was a young guy, maybe mid-20s. He drove an expensive-looking BMW and always dressed in flashy clothing, so I figured he was either well-off or seriously pretending. I hope I'm not giving the wrong impression about him. He was actually really sweet. He introduced himself to us after a few days. His name was Quinn, and he was a few years out of college like I had guessed. He was a really bright guy and got along really well with Benjamin. They laughed and talked about sports, and Benjamin even dropped a few of his own college stories that I hadn't heard in a long time. Quinn said he worked in the entertainment industry, and that he did freelance work for some internet personality person, whatever that means. It kind of went over my head, but it must have been lucrative. He looked pretty wealthy, like I said. He talked about stocks with Benjamin and told us about some of the investments he was making. All in all, he seems like a nice guy. Things were normal for a few months. Like I said, I spent a lot of time on my porch, so Quinn would often wave to me when leaving his house, and I always waved back. I can't remember exactly when, but I started noticing the same girl going over to Quinn's house every so often. She drove a little white convertible and she was pretty, young, blonde, the type of girl you'd expect a guy like him to date. To be frank, she dressed a bit scandalously, which I didn't fully appreciate. I figured she was his girlfriend, maybe checking on the house while he was out. She had her own house key, so it made sense. It became a regular thing. Once, maybe twice a week, I'd see that car roll up while Quinn was gone. She'd go inside, stay for a while, then leave. I didn't really understand what she was doing, but young people date differently these days, so I kept my thoughts to myself. Then, one evening, I saw them together. Quinn pulled into his driveway with her in the passenger seat. That confirmed it. She was his girlfriend, just as I had assumed. But shortly after that day, things started getting tense. At least, that's what it seemed like. One afternoon, I was out tending to my little garden when I heard shouting from across the street. Quinn and the girl were standing in the driveway yelling at each other. I couldn't catch what they were arguing about, but I didn't need to. She kept throwing her hands in the air, practically spitting her words at him. It looked like she was going to strike him. Eventually, she got in the car, slammed the door, and tore off down the road. Quinn shook his head and went back inside. I don't even think he noticed me. I figured it was a lover's spat. Every couple fights, and it wasn't my place to butt in where I was unwelcome. But then I saw that girl's car in front of his house again when he wasn't home. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. I told Benjamin, and he said it was rude to pry and that I should just leave the poor boy alone, which I agreed with. But then came the night everything went sideways. Benjamin and I were asleep when we woke up to sirens blaring outside. We rushed outside, joining the handful of neighbors who had come out to see what was going on. Quinn's house was swarming. Police cars, an ambulance, the whole nine. We watched as the cops emerged from his house with that girl in handcuffs. She didn't struggle or scream, just accepted what was going on and stared ahead with a blank expression. We saw Quinn being rushed outside on a stretcher. He was a bloody mess, and I gasped at the sight. We didn't see him for a week after that. I was worried sick. When he finally came back, Benjamin and I walked over to check on him. He let us in without hesitation and told us everything. Apparently, that girl, her name was Ellie, had confessed to everything, making things easy for the police. For starters, she wasn't supposed to have his house key. She had stolen his spare and made a copy without him knowing. According to him, she started asking him for things. Fancy dinners, jewelry, expensive trips. When he hesitated, she got possessive and angry, which was when things started going downhill in their relationship. Every time she had shown up unannounced to his house, he hadn't been aware. She had access to his location through his phone, which I didn't even know was possible. She had gone through all of his stuff, but worst of all, she had planted hidden cameras in his room. Every time she went back to his house when he wasn't there, she was replacing the camera batteries and making sure they were still working. The argument between them that I overheard was Quinn's attempt at breaking up with her. She refused, and Quinn reluctantly agreed to go on a break. Ellie had seen everything through the cameras, and the next night, she went to his house with a knife. I'm not going to explain the rest, you get the idea. Somehow, Quinn managed to get her to the grounds, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctors said he was an inch away from needing surgery, or dying. Benjamin and I tried to console him, but he was visibly shaken. The last thing he said before we left was that he had learned his lesson about flaunting his money, especially around pretty girls. He moved out not long after. He said he didn't feel safe in that house anymore, and that his ex had tons of friends just like her, and he didn't feel comfortable with the thought that they might have known where he lived. We never saw him again. I pray to God he's doing okay. No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not someone as young as him. When I moved into my new place, I was just looking for a fresh start. I won't get into the details, but let's just say I had a bad situation with an ex that made staying in my old city impossible. I ran into some money early in life and made some bad decisions about the kind of women I surrounded myself with. Lesson learned. The neighborhood I moved to is really nice. Low crime, quiet, mostly families. The houses here are really spaced out, which was partially what drew me there. But for some reason, the property next to mine is much closer in proximity than most of the other properties are to each other. And by the way, that house next door is huge. When I first saw it, I thought I could easily fit a family of 10. That's honestly what I assumed at first, that a big family lived there, grandparents and everything. But I could not have been more wrong. Even though I try to be low-key, I wasn't going to be a rude neighbor. I took it upon myself to introduce myself to everyone in the neighborhood. For whatever reason, I decided to introduce myself to my next-door neighbors last. I couldn't tell you why. Everyone else I met seemed really sweet and genuine. I'd say 90% of them were parents of young children. And yes, they were all slightly intimidating, purely based on how successful they seemed to be. I wasn't too sure how a younger guy like myself would easily blend into a community like that, but that was more of a personal concern. When I got around to meeting my next-door neighbor, my social battery was mostly drained from having spent the day making small talk with strangers. I knew if I just went back home, I was never going to be as motivated to meet them, so I just sucked it up and walked up their driveway. I had gotten accustomed to being greeted by someone middle-aged, so when a young-looking dude in a mullet opened the door, I was a little taken aback. Hell, he looked even younger than me, which was definitely a shock. I recovered quickly and went ahead with my new-to-the-neighborhood spiel. As I went on, he flashed me this massive smile and actually cut me off before I could even finish talking. He said something along the lines of, "Oh wow, someone who was born in my decade, what a nice surprise." I laughed and told him the same thing, venting to him about how out of place I felt as a single guy in his late 20s amongst so many families with kids. He told me not to worry about that and that most of the people who lived here kept to themselves, which was kind of a relief for me. He introduced himself as Damon and told me I should come by for a drink sometime. I shrugged my shoulders and said, hell, why not right now? To which I expected him to laugh and invite me in. Instead, though, he looked over his shoulder like he was scanning his living room, and then he turned back to me, saying he wished he could, but he was busy working. I asked him what he did for work, because it just seems like a normal follow-up question to what he said, and he dropped his smile a bit. After a weird stare, he laughed and just said, finance, but didn't elaborate any more than that, which I thought was a bit strange. I told him fair enough, and asked if he had any roommates. To my surprise, he told me he lived there alone, which was absolutely insane to me given how big the house was. We chit-chatted for a few more minutes, and he gave me his number before going back inside. I was excited that someone my age lived here, especially because he seemed like a really chill guy, but I couldn't get over how odd it was for someone like that to live all alone. And yeah, I know I was essentially doing the same thing, but you have to keep in mind my house wasn't even half the size of his. Anyway, I went back home and got on with my life. That was about 6 months ago. For a few weeks after that, nothing eventful really happened. I texted Damon a few days after he gave me his number to try and set something up, but he'd always complain about how busy he was and how sorry he was that we couldn't hang out. Eventually, I gave up with him. Not in a hostile way, just in a you-do-you kind of way. I'm definitely not the type of person to bend over backwards for someone who seems disinterested. I never saw anyone coming or going from Damon's place. No visitors, no parties, no girls, nothing. He never even got takeout delivered, which was strange to me because his car was always in the driveway. I genuinely didn't know what he ate because I literally never saw him leave the house. The guy lived like a ghost. I work from home, and the office in my house is on the 3rd floor, which overlooks Damon's property, if you're wondering how I knew so much about his living habits. I know it sounds obsessive and a little creepy, but his house was also just a glance away from my monitor, so I couldn't help but look over from time to time. One night, it was a Wednesday night, I remember that distinctly, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of loud music. I sleep with my windows open, so that's probably how I woke up so easily. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or it was part of a really vivid dream I was having, but I was wrong. I got out of bed and peeked out my window, and there they were, 7 or so cars lined up in Damon's driveway. There was no mistaking it, he was having a party. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the type to complain about some noise. I've been to my fair share of house parties, but it was the middle of the week, and the volume was insane. I figured I'd just go over, knock, and ask him to turn it down. I threw on a hoodie and walked over. It was a full-blown party, that much was clear from outside. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I pulled out my phone to text Damon, but I decided against it, knowing he'd probably ignore me and give me some BS excuse the following morning. I knocked on the door again, harder this time. Still nothing. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside, the first thing I saw was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs. But there was something off. There was literally no one in there. I moved further in, expecting to see people in the living room, maybe the kitchen, but it was completely empty. There weren't even any drinks left out. I could hear people over the music that was playing in the background though, which I didn't understand. But then I really listened to it, and everything hit me all at once. It wasn't even music, really. It was a recording, a literal recording of people laughing, yelling, clinking glasses. The whole party was fake, all of it. But that didn't make sense to me. It still didn't explain the shoes or the cars. There were people in that house, that much was certain. I should have turned around right then, but I needed to know what was going on. I moved discreetly around the house until I saw a door that was slightly ajar. I gently pushed it open and it led down to the basement. I'm not sure how I knew, but something told me what I was looking for was downstairs. It was dark down those stairs with the exception of a very faint light coming from somewhere I couldn't see. There was no reason to go down there, I knew that, but I did it anyway. I got to the bottom of the stairs and looked around. The light was coming from another door somewhere deeper in the basement. I crept towards it, and as I got closer, I started to pick up on another noise I hadn't been able to hear earlier over the music. It sounded almost mechanical. It was this heavy, rhythmic grinding, like heavy machinery or a buzzsaw or something. I got a little closer, close enough to see through the crack. There were 3 people standing in there, looking across the room at something that was out of view. They were all older-looking guys, significantly older than Damon. They were wearing heavy-duty work clothes and had on these protective goggles and thick rubber gloves. I also realized they were wearing what looked like work boots, even though I had seen all those other shoes upstairs. Under different circumstances, I would have assumed that they were construction workers. I really wanted to see what they were looking at, but it was too far out of view. After a few seconds of me just standing there, I started to pick up on this awful bleach smell, or some kind of cleaning solution. That's what did it for me. I started to feel this awful pit in my stomach, like my life was in danger. I can't explain it. I turned to leave, trying to be as quiet as possible. As I was finding my way back to the stairs, the light from behind me suddenly dimmed, like someone had shut the door behind me. I didn't actually hear the door over the music, but I felt it. I sprinted up the stairs as fast as I could. I ran through the house and burst out the front door. I didn't run directly to my house. I jumped my own fence and made it to the backyard. I slipped in through my side door, locking it behind me. My chest was pounding, but under no circumstances could I let Damon or any of those other guys know it was me who had been snooping around. I gathered myself and went up to my office, making sure all the lights up there were off. I crouched down below the window and peeked over at Damon's house. There was no one there. But then, a few minutes later, the front door flew open and like 8 guys poured out, scanning the yard, the driveway, the street, but Damon wasn't with them. I could tell because everyone looked older, like those first guys I had seen. A few of them looked like they were arguing about something, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. One of the men actually shoved one of the other ones, and I thought they were about to start fighting in the street, but they didn't. Eventually, they all went back inside, and the music stopped soon after that. I stood at the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought about calling the cops, but what would I even say? The music wasn't playing anymore, and there was no real crime I could actually report. The thing I couldn't understand was how none of my other neighbors had a problem with the loud music, especially since most of them had children. I figured if they hadn't been able to hear it and I called the police, Damon would know it was me. And the shoes, I had no idea what that was about either. The people I had seen were all wearing boots. So did they bring extra pairs of shoes just to leave in the foyer? I had too many questions and I didn't know what to do, so I just went to bed. The next morning, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. Every single car was gone, including Damon's. I went upstairs to try and get some work done, but I couldn't concentrate and found myself looking over at Damon's house every 5 seconds. After a few hours of his car not being there, I decided to go for a walk, partly to clear my head, but mostly to take some low-key glances through his windows. Nothing, though. Days passed and Damon still didn't return, or his car didn't at least. I was baffled with every passing day. I still couldn't figure out how my other neighbors had been able to sleep through all the noises that night, so I just straight up asked them. I went to a few houses and asked them if they had heard the party he had a few nights ago. No one knew what I was talking about, even after I told them which house it was coming from and how late it was. I thought I was going crazy. That was a few months ago now. The crazy thing is Damon still hasn't returned, and it's clear no one is maintaining his house, as the grass is starting to get really long, and there's an untouched pile of packages leaning against his front door. I don't know what to make of this. It could be nothing, but I feel like no one would go to such lengths to disguise what they were doing with a fake party, unless it was something illegal. But would people going to such lengths really forget something as important as locking the front door? Maybe that's what those guys had been arguing about. I really have no idea, and the fact that none of my other neighbors seemed bothered by it makes me think I'm involved in some huge conspiracy or something. I know I'm just being paranoid, but I just have so many unanswered questions. When Damon returns, if he ever does, I'm debating whether or not I should just go and straight up ask him. I'll get right to the point. My middle son is a senior in college. He's a good kid, most of the time. I'm a bit cross with him right now, because he just asked me for money for a spring break trip to Hawaii with his friends, which kind of caught me off guard. Like I said, he's a good kid, and I want him to enjoy himself, but something about the way he asked rubbed me the wrong way. His mother's been struggling with her mental health lately, and it would have meant a lot to her to have him around. But I guess he's more preoccupied with getting wasted on a beach with his frat brothers. I can't even say I blame him for it. I was exactly the same when I was his age, and I see a lot of myself in that kid. The whole thing actually got me reminiscing about my own college days and reminded me about something I haven't thought about in a very long time, which is the story I'm about to tell. Funnily enough, my son is the one who introduced me to this page, so maybe he'll get a kick out of this if it gets read. I went to Wharton, class of '85, something I'm still damn proud of. It was and still is the most prestigious business school in the world, and I took that reputation seriously. I had my fun, but I also worked like hell. It was a different time back then. A lot of my classmates were crazy, like Wolf of Wall Street crazy, and I did my best to avoid getting swept up into that life. My junior year, though, I did something a little impulsive. I was dating a Puerto Rican girl named Maria Munez, who I remember fondly. Sometimes I try to imagine how different my life would have been if I had chosen to take things further with various girlfriends I had, her being one of them. Instead of going home for spring break like I usually did, Maria convinced me to come home to Puerto Rico to meet her extended family. It was my first time on the island, and I was eager to impress her, so I agreed without hesitation. That being said, I was a nervous wreck. I didn't want to mess anything up, and Maria often joked about how open Puerto Rican families were, so I was aware that they already knew a lot about me. It turned out that my anxiety was mostly unjustified, as I got along really well with everyone upon meeting them, and it seemed like they really liked me. Most of the trip was about meeting her relatives, but we did have time for a few outings of our own. I mean, it was spring break after all. One of those outings was a hike through El Janqué, which, fun fact, is the only tropical rainforest in the US National Forest System. Neither of us had a car, obviously, so Maria's mother drove us and dropped us off at one of the most popular trailheads. The two of us were pretty devious, so we definitely took advantage of the fact that neither of us had to drive. The plan was to hike, enjoy the scenery, and sneak a little rum we'd packed. Everything was lining up to be perfect, but we quickly realized there was a big problem. The trail we were most excited about was closed. I don't remember why, flooding, maintenance, something like that, but all I remember was that Maria was really upset. I tried to calm her down and told her we could just hike one of the many other trails the forest had to offer. She wasn't budging though, and told me that the trail we planned on hiking was like the premier trail, and the other ones didn't even come close. How one hiking trail could be astronomically better than the other, I really couldn't tell you. She was adamant though, and I had long since learned the dangers of arguing with her over something like this. So I asked her what she wanted to do instead, and she told me we should just hike the closed trail anyway. Like I said, I was kind of rebellious back then, and so was she. So when she proposed that idea, I was on board. We'd come all this way, and now some rule was going to stop us? No chance. She gave me a look, and that was all it took. We made sure there was no one around, slipped past the barriers, and started up the trail, laughing like a couple of idiots. At first, it was exactly what we wanted. Better even. It felt like we had the whole forest to ourselves, which was especially awesome given how popular this trail would have been otherwise. Imagine visiting a world-famous natural site, except you're the only one there. That kind of exclusivity is impossible to come by. Anyway, we hiked for a decent while, passing little waterfalls and admiring the beauty of the forest. And yes, we were also drinking. Not excessively, but just enough to feel a good buzz. It was really fun, I have to be honest. But then, out of nowhere, Maria screamed and jumped back, almost knocking me over. That instantly put me on high alert, although I didn't know what had scared her. I looked around frantically until I saw it. A little further down the path was what looked like a freshly decapitated mongoose. Let me repeat that, it was a mongoose. A big one too, and its head looked like it was completely missing. I told Maria to stay where she was and approached the carcass by myself, hoping it was maybe a stuffed animal or something. It wasn't. I inspected it without getting too close, and confirmed what I initially thought. Its head was cleanly sliced off. The cut was too precise for it to have been anything other than a knife wound, which was downright disturbing. The worst part, though, was that the body hadn't started smelling yet, meaning it probably hadn't been there for very long. Maria was shaking. I was mostly shocked by it. I tried to reassure her by saying something dumb, like how crime in a national forest was unlikely, even though I couldn't explain it myself. I put my arm around her and ushered her past the body, trying to block it from the line of sight. All I could think about in that moment was putting some serious distance between us and that poor lifeless creature. We walked in silence for a while, and even though we distanced ourselves from the mongoose, I could tell the moment was gone. The adrenaline rush had worn off my buzz and erased my good mood. As bad as I felt, though, I could tell that Maria was significantly more shaken, and I couldn't imagine that she was even enjoying herself in the slightest. She said that she wanted to stick to our original plan of hiking the whole trail to the other side, but it was obvious that she didn't want to be in that forest anymore, and I couldn't blame her. As we were walking, I couldn't help but rack my brain, trying to figure out what we had stumbled upon. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't aware of the hunting laws there, but I couldn't imagine that hunting in a national forest so close to a pedestrian trail could be legal. And yet, that was the only explanation I could think of. Why they had left that mongoose's body there to rot was beyond me, but there was no other rational explanation. Maybe it was a hunter who had seized upon the opportunity to have that part of the forest all to himself, like we had. I really didn't know. Maria and I hiked another mile or so, with me trying to cheer her up the whole time, but nothing was working. Eventually, she admitted that she wasn't feeling well and wanted to turn back. I didn't argue, although I was definitely dreading having to walk past that spot again, mostly because I wasn't sure how it was going to affect her, and I just wanted her to feel comfortable. We retraced our steps, and I could tell we were closing in on the spot where the mongoose had been. I told Maria to keep her head down so she wouldn't see, and she did. I braced myself as we turned the final bend, but when the spot came into view, the mongoose was no longer there. Someone had moved it. My heartbeat started racing, and I instantly began scanning nearby trees, terrified that there was someone hiding among them. I was not prepared for what came next. Instead of seeing a person, I noticed something hanging from one of the trees. It was a mongoose. It was strung up with twine, its paws tied together. There was a sickly green liquid dripping from its body that hadn't been there before, and it was rotating slowly in the wind. I couldn't help but curse out loud when I saw it, which caused Maria to open her eyes. As soon as she saw it, she let out an awful, blood-curdling scream of pure terror. Before she could freeze up, I grabbed her wrist and told her to run. We took off sprinting down the trail, trying not to trip over each other. I let her go in front of me and kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be following us. Instead, a deafening scream rang out from somewhere behind us. It was a woman's scream, and it was absolutely terrifying. It sounded like the kind of scream someone getting attacked would make. I felt Maria's body jolt mid-stride, and for a second, I thought she was going to collapse. She let out this panicked sob and tried to push herself even harder, but she was already out of breath. I kept my grip on her wrist, practically dragging her along as she slowed down. We couldn't stop. My own chest was burning, but we needed to keep moving. Eventually, Maria could barely run anymore, so we had no choice but to slow down to a fast walk. I turned around completely and started walking backward, keeping my eyes locked on the trail behind us. I was bracing myself for a fight. Something had strung up that mongoose. Something had caused that scream. I was 100% sure that I'd see something charging towards us any second. but nothing ever happened. The trailhead finally came into view, and for a brief second, I thought we were in the clear. But then I saw someone standing near the barricades watching us. It was a park worker with his arms crossed, clearly pissed off. As soon as we slipped past the barricades, he started yelling at us about breaking the rules and told us he was kicking us out and banning us for life. But then he got a good look at Maria, who at that point was both sobbing and physically exhausted. I told the guy everything, not leaving a single detail out. He took it really seriously. He told us we both needed to come with him, so we did. We were taken to a small ranger station near the parking lot where a supervisor was waiting. I had to go through the story again, then again when they called the police. Maria didn't say a word. Eventually, her mother arrived and we left, still shaken. I never heard anything about what the authorities found, or if they even bothered investigating. I'm sure Maria's family might have heard something, but we broke up the following summer, and we fell out of contact after that, so I really wouldn't know. I haven't thought about this experience in a long time, but it's still just as unsettling as it was all those years ago. I think the worst part about the whole thing was that scream, because we never saw anyone else on that trail, and I have no idea who it belonged to. I'd consider myself a pretty laid-back guy. I'd say the same about most of my friends. This happened last year, so I'll get right into it. Spring break was supposed to be just me and my friends Jackson, Ariel, and Isabel camping on a secluded beach in Alabama. No crowds, just stars and waves. We got there late, later than we planned. We parked in the closest lot and began walking toward the beach. The place was dead quiet. No other campers, no fishermen, nothing but empty sand stretching for miles. According to Isabel, who was familiar with the area, locals sometimes use that part of the beach for overnight fishing, but that night it was empty. It wasn't fully dark out yet, but the sun had started setting, so we'd need to set up camp quickly. Jackson and I began pitching the tents. Since I had driven, I had brought my dog Bean with me. He was a Doberman who loved the sand, so we all got a kick out of watching him run and roll around. At one point, Ariel pointed out a car in the distance, saying it had driven by twice already. I turned. An old, beat-up-looking SUV slowly rolled past on the narrow access road that ran parallel to the dunes. The access road was a little more than a strip of packed sand, just wide enough for one car. On one side was the beach where we were, and the other side was a line of shrubs. You couldn't really see the main roads from where we were. The car drove by and ultimately disappeared down the road. The four of us shrugged it off and went back to setting up, and by the time we finished, we decided to crack a few beers and chop it up in a circle. The girls drank seltzers instead of beer, which we made fun of them for. It was almost fully dark at that point. I can't remember who noticed it first, but that car that had driven by was back again, only this time, it stopped when it was parallel to us. The driver's door opened and a man got out. I could tell it was a man because he was really tall, although I couldn't make out any features of his face. He began walking towards us, and the girls got nervous. Jackson and I told them not to worry, and we got up to go intercept the man before he could reach our campsite. Bean was already on high alert, so I told him to come with us. As we got closer, I started to notice that he was walking oddly. There was this slight limp in his walk, and he almost stumbled a few times. When we got close enough, Jackson said, "How's it going, man?" trying to keep things light. The guy didn't waste any time. He immediately said, "You're on my property." He slurred his words a bit, and I figured he was a little drunk. I told him we thought the beach was public land. Keep in mind, it was really unlikely that some dude owned the beach. There were no private signs anyway. After I said that, the guy didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out a knife. Bean started growling in response to the man's body language, which honestly should have scared the guy off given how scary Dobermans look. But he didn't budge. Instead, he started running towards us with his knife outstretched. Bean charged at him and jumped to attack his arm that was holding the knife, causing him to fall to the ground. I yelled no at the top of my lungs as I didn't want my dog to get stabbed, but Bean somehow got the dude to drop the knife. The man screamed in pain as Bean bit his arm. I whistled for him to get off and he listened to me. He ran back to my side, but kept his eyes on the guy who was now writhing in pain on the ground. Eventually, the guy got up and started running back towards his car. Jackson and I ran back to the girls, telling them everything. By the time we finished, that SUV had driven off. The girls wanted to pack up and carry everything back to the car, but there was a part of me that was nervous about that plan. That guy was unhinged. There was no telling what he'd do, and I wasn't keen on walking in darkness with my hands full. Isabel made a good point though, saying that he might return with a gun or something. I told Ariel to call the police and tell them where we were and what happened. Once the police were close by, the four of us started walking towards the parking lot with our stuff. Bean was on high alert, and I have to admit the only reason I felt even remotely safe was because of him. I noticed lights up ahead near my car, and I was relieved. The officer stepped out to take our statements, and I was not ready for what happened next. He quickly pointed out my car's tires were slashed, and I was horrified to find out they were. The officer unholstered his weapon and told me to unlock the car, which I did. He opened my trunk, but thank God it was a false alarm. The officer was nice enough to help me with my tire situation. Thank God we brought Bean with us that night. That guy was probably a drunken lunatic. It could have probably been a quadruple murder if he had gotten his way. Finding a nice secluded place to hang out is definitely an awesome time, but it obviously comes with its risks. It was spring break 2023. My friend Michelle and I booked a trip to Miami for a weekend. It was both of our first times in Miami. We were both 22. We stayed at some full house rental in Wynwood, which was like a 20-minute Uber from the beach. We got there on Thursday and we were staying until Monday. We landed pretty late in the day Thursday, so we just went out to some nearby bars for the first night. It was fun. The following day, we Ubered to Miami Beach to have a beach day. We brought the towels from the rental and just laid on the beach for hours. Multiple groups of guys approached us, and we just reject them or whatever. But there was one guy who approached us, I guess specifically me, that just had this really charming accent, seemingly nice forward personality, and honestly everything about him was handsome, from his hair down to his physique. He introduced himself as Will. He asked what our plans for the night were and asked for my number, and honestly I gave it to him. Then he was off on his way down the beach. He didn't seem to be with anyone. We watched to see if he'd stop and try to get more numbers, but he didn't. He was just walking away looking at his phone, and eventually walked off the beach in the direction of the street. Michelle was a little jealous that he showed me more attention, I could tell. Later that day, after the beach and some bars, we left Miami Beach because it was a little too crazy for us. Definitely because it was spring break, but it was just a bit much. We returned to the rental with some drinks and snacks from a nearby store. We drank in the backyard by the pool, listening to music on Michelle's speaker while we plotted our night. It was around this time I shot Will a text asking what he was doing for the night. He responded very quickly, saying he and his friend didn't have plans yet, and then he suggested the four of us go out by us in Wynwood. Michelle jokingly asked if the friend was cute, but I wasn't going to ask that. We made a plan for Will and his friend to come pregame with us at the rental, so they came around 8. The friend's name was Ken, and he was surprisingly good looking as well. I could tell Michelle was pleasantly surprised. They brought their own drinks and left them on the counter in the kitchen, and we drank in the yard for like an hour. They seemed very normal. All seemed like it was going well. We eventually walked to a nearby bar. It was also in Wynwood. I have to admit, Michelle and I were already drunk, and Ken and Will kept buying rounds of shots. Things became a blur pretty quickly. I wouldn't say I blacked out, but bits and pieces of my memory became foggy at that point. Eventually, Michelle and Ken went to another side of the bar, presumably to hook up, so I was alone with Will for quite some time. Eventually, I had to go to the bathroom, but before I left, I remember him calling out, "What do I want for my next drink?" I replied back, "A tequila soda." When I came back out from the bathroom, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Will was like hovering over the corner of the bar, clearly doing something sketchy. I walked a certain direction to get a better angle, and I saw he had the 2 drinks in front of him, but he was hovered over them as if he were doing something to my drink. I may have been drunk, but that was enough for my intuition to tell me to leave. I walked away without him noticing to the other side of the bar, looking for Michelle, but she and Ken were gone apparently. So I rushed out of the bar and tried calling her a bunch of times, but she never picked up. Around this time, Will texted me asking where I went. I ignored it. I texted Michelle a bunch of times, asking what happened, where is she? And then I eventually dropped the bomb that I think Will was trying to roofie me and that we should get away from these guys. I started walking back to the Airbnb. This was when Michelle texted back, asking, why do you think he was roofieing you? And I said because he was hovering over the drink he ordered for me, doing something to it. She texted back, maybe he was just on his phone. I tried calling her, but again, she didn't pick up. She texted back instead, saying, I'm still with Ken, just text. I responded to her that I already left, so I'm not going back anyway, and I suggested she meet me at the Airbnb. She responded, I'll be back soon. So I walked back. When I got back, I let myself in with the code lock. The door automatically locked after like 10 seconds. Same thing with the back door. I sat, really drunk and by myself, honestly worried about Michelle, but also I feel like I was wondering if I was just overthinking the whole roofies thing. Maybe he was just on his phone. Either way, it was too late now. I was surprised that Will never attempted to text or call me again. Next thing I remember was the doorknob to the back door jiggling, and then I heard the button sound effects of the code lock, followed by a failed attempt sound effect. I then got a text from Michelle saying to open the back door. I went to the back door and called Michelle's name through the door. She didn't answer though. So I tried calling her phone, but she didn't pick up. I got a text back saying, hurry, open the door, he's coming. And this was when I really started to freak out. I yelled through the door, Michelle, you're scaring me. There was no peephole or windows to look through to see if it was really her. I begged her to please answer me. She never did. There was a peephole in the front door, so I hurried to the front and looked through it. I actually felt sick at this moment, scared for my life, because I saw what looked like Will hiding to the side of the front door. A million thoughts crossed my mind, like if Michelle was running from Will. I was still too terrified to open the back door without her confirming it was her. I texted her back that I'm calling 911 right now. She didn't respond. I actually did call 911 and explained, and while I was on the phone, I checked the peephole again, and Will was gone. When police showed up, I let them in, and within 5 minutes, one of them asked if my friend was blonde, and I said yes. He then told me that another officer had her in their squad car and was bringing her here. I was so relieved, but also horrified. When she arrived in a second police car, she had been visibly crying. She was very, very drunk. To the best of her ability, she explained that she had her phone stolen and she was lost wandering the streets for an hour until someone helped her call the police. All of the texts I got from her number were never her. It was that guy she was with, Ken, or whatever his real name was. We also found her phone thrown in the pool in the backyard. They clearly took off the second I mentioned the police. We had to make a police report giving every last detail as specifically as possible. They said they'd get the surveillance footage from the bar we went to. We also had to contact the Airbnb host and immediately cancel our stay and go somewhere else. It was a long, nightmarish night. Obviously, the rest of our trip was completely spoiled. It took a whole week before hearing back anything from the police, and the only reason they called was to confirm what the name that guy that I was texting gave me, because it didn't align with the phone records for that number, which I'd already figured out myself. He was using another stolen phone. After that, I never heard from the police again, which is absolutely sickening how little priority the police put into cases like this, even with easy evidence. I have no interest in returning to Miami after this horrible experience. I could have honestly been killed. My name is Anna. My friend Lena and I had been looking forward to spring break for weeks. We were two broke college juniors desperate for a change of scenery, but neither of us could afford the classic trip to Mexico or Hawaii, so we were kind of restricted to somewhere in the continental US, preferably not too far away. So when we found a cheap Airbnb near Charleston's historic district, we booked it immediately. 5 nights of food, bars, and exploring. It felt like exactly what we needed. Plus, it was my first spring break above the age of 21, so I wouldn't have to constantly stress about which places were likely to snatch my fake ID. By the third night, we'd settled into a routine, sightseeing during the day, hopping between restaurants and bars in the evening. I'm not a heavy drinker, and neither is Lena, so we were getting more enjoyment out of just experiencing what the city had to offer. Early that evening, we ended up at this tiny seafood spot we had found online. Fried shrimp, hush puppies, sweet tea, you know, that sort of vibe. The place honestly felt like a hidden gem, and I was impressed that Lena had been able to sift through all the touristy stuff to find something a bit more authentic. The good vibe didn't last though. We were halfway through our late lunch when my phone buzzed. I glanced down. It was a number I didn't recognize. The message just said, "Hey." I stared at it for a few seconds before showing Lena, asking her if she knew the number. She looked at my phone and said she didn't. I figured it was just a scam or something, but usually those scam texts say more than just "hey." Maybe it was a wrong number. I typed back a quick "who is this?" and went back to eating. Lena and I were laughing about something silly when another text from that same number popped up on my phone. It said, "Look outside." That one made me pause. I glanced toward the window next to our table, expecting to see someone waving or messing with me. Maybe one of my friends from school had coincidentally taken a trip to Charleston at the same time we had. But there was nothing, just the street with people walking by like normal. I told Lena someone was messing with me, and she agreed, saying it was probably just a prank. I laughed, but the thought of that really creeped me out. None of my friends were really the type to do that, but I guessed it could have been some guy who had previously hit on me and was bored or something. Up until that point, the whole thing still felt harmless, but then another message came through, just a few minutes later. It said one word, "Anna." That stopped me cold. If this person knew my name, it definitely wasn't a wrong number. Probably not a scam either. I gasped and showed Lena, and she reminded me about something I had completely forgotten about. On our first day in Charleston, Lena and I had entered one of those giveaways at a local cafe. It was one of those win a free meal promotions where they ask for your name and number and a few other things. It had completely slipped my mind, but as soon as Lena brought it up, that's all I could think about. I hadn't given my number to anyone in Charleston either, so it made sense. I told Lena whoever was texting me probably had her number as well, and the two of us kind of freaked each other out. Dinner wasn't as fun after that. In all honesty, I felt too out in the open. We paid the bill and decided to shake it off at a rooftop bar across town. It was packed and seemed like the type of place that attracted a younger crowd, so it was a no-brainer. After a few drinks, I was starting to loosen up, and Lena and I were enjoying ourselves again. But of course, that didn't last long. I got another message from that number, but this one was so much worse. It said, "That's a nice red jacket." I went stiff. I was wearing a red jacket. In fact, I was one of the only people there who was even wearing red. I looked around frantically, but it was useless. The place was crowded, filled with people laughing and drinking, but no one was looking at me. At least, not obviously. I showed Lena the message, and she said we should leave. The two of us started making our way back to the Airbnb as cautiously as possible. I kept glancing around behind us to make sure we weren't being followed, and we weren't. By the time we got inside, I bolted the door and double-checked every lock. We shut the curtains and locked all the windows too, trying to convince ourselves we were just overreacting. But an hour after we got back to the Airbnb, we started getting hungry, but neither of us wanted to leave. We ordered Uber Eats instead, picking some random burger place a few blocks away. I always had my Uber Eats setting set to leave at door by default, as I had a really bad experience with a delivery driver a while back that I don't want to talk about. The estimated wait time was 50 minutes, which felt like forever. We distracted ourselves by watching some dumb reality show, trying to shake off the lingering paranoia from earlier. For a little while, it worked. Eventually, there was a knock at the door. I looked down at my phone and saw a notification from Uber Eats saying the driver was arriving. I was confused though. Normally, Uber Eats would send a photo when the food was dropped off, so I wasn't too sure why our driver had knocked on the door. I looked at Lena, and she looked equally confused. I got up and checked the peephole, and yeah, it was a random, bulky-looking dude in a hoodie holding our bag of food. He just looked like a normal Uber Eats driver. I watched for a few moments, expecting him to set our food down and leave, but he just stood there. After a while, he knocked on the door again and said out loud, "Uber Eats for Anna." I said thank you and that he could just leave it out there, but he still didn't move. There was a long pause, and then he finally said I needed to come out and sign something real quick. That wasn't right. I exchanged a knowing glance with Lena. Something was very wrong about this. She immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911, mouthing, "just in case," to me. I wasn't gonna argue. Looking back, speaking out loud to that guy probably wasn't a smart choice, because after that, he started knocking on the door more aggressively. He kept saying that he had other deliveries to make and that he just needed a quick signature, but I knew that was BS. When I didn't respond, he started jiggling the doorknob. When it didn't budge, he started banging on the door, shouting my name. I honestly thought he was going to kick the door down, and I don't think Lena and I would have been able to fend him off had he done so. But then I heard a siren in the distance, and the banging on the door stopped. I heard the bag of food fall to the porch, followed by rapid footsteps running away from the house. There was quite the commotion on our yard. We heard officers yelling and sirens blaring. Lena and I rushed to one of the windows just in time to see two officers tackling that guy in the hoodie a few houses over. We didn't dare go outside, but we watched as they put him in cuffs and escorted him to the back of one of their cars. The officers then came to our house and we told them everything, including the texts I had been receiving. By some miracle, one of the officers had been patrolling just 2 blocks from our Airbnb when Lena placed the call, which explained how they showed up so quickly. Thankfully, we were in a very happening area. They took our statements and told us we'd be hearing from them soon. It turned out our cafe theory was spot on. He worked there. He had taken photos of the giveaway forms and had been following us since that afternoon, probably because we had written down that we were just visiting for spring break, and that made us easy targets or something. The cops' running theory was that he had followed us home from the bar and waited outside our house. When the Uber Eats driver pulled up, he must have convinced him to hand over the food, maybe pretending to be my boyfriend or something. The guy also apparently had a criminal record, which made the situation even worse. We were dealing with someone with a very violent history, and that was downright terrifying. The rest of the trip kind of sucked, and when it got time to leave Charleston, I was relieved. I still don't know what that guy's plan was. Maybe he thought if we opened the door, he could push his way in and do God knows what. Either way, I try not to think about what would have happened if Lena hadn't called the police when she did, or even worse, if the police hadn't been able to get there in time.